Chapter 94. Garona tilted her head, seemingly thinking about the meaning of the word, king. Lang smiled. If you think that the supreme leader of a force is the chief, all right. I think I'm the chieftain of the Storm clan as you know it. Garona tilted her head to the other side, her face full of doubt. You don't look like one. The simple and straightforward answer made Lang almost choke to death. This time it was the two bastards Lothar and Fordragon who snickered. Lang seemed to be quickly examining himself to ensure that his appearance was correct. After confirming that there was nothing wrong with his appearance, he asked, "Why don't you look like one?" "Because you're weaker than Andoin. You're even weaker than the male next to you." Garona pointed at Bolvar. "In our clan, only the strongest warrior is worthy of being the chief." Lang was speechless. Frankly speaking, as a busy king, Lang was also strict with himself, and trained his skills every day. Lang dared to say that he could easily defeat the kings of the other 6 human kingdoms. Unfortunately, his strength could not compare to that of Lothar, who was currently recognized as the strongest human. Duque had always thought that if the powerful first-generation paladins were to appear in the future, they might not be able to defeat Lothar without the power of the Holy Light. Moreover, Lothar was now in his 40s and had long passed the most powerful age of a warrior. In fact, Lothar was still the most powerful at his peak. In order to avoid the awkwardness of the topic, Lothar held back his laughter and stepped forward to smooth things over. "We humans do not determine who is the chief purely by force. If there's time in the future, we'll let you understand. Now, shouldn't we get down to business first? I heard that you brought Khadgar's corpse?" "Ah yes. Khadgar's corpse, which was still warm, was carried in." It was hard to believe that Khadgar was dead when he looked at the soft body that was not stiff and did not have livor mortis spots. Lothar stepped forward and could even feel a faint breath coming from his nostrils. The old court mage by Lang's side examined the corpse and said, "Khadgar is indeed dead. His soul is no longer there. This is the work of a demon." Lothar could only nod. At this moment Garona said, "I also brought a message from Khadgar before he lost his soul." "Oral message?" "Yes, he said that Mediva's body might have been taken over by a demon, and that it was Mediv who opened the dark door and attracted us orcs." "What?" Lang and Andoin looked as if they had seen a ghost. Duque had just said that he wanted to attack Karazhan, and Garona came to be a witness? If they weren't absolutely sure that Khadgar had been in Karazhan all this time and that Mediv had betrayed them a long time ago, they would have suspected that Duque had killed Khadgar and sent a female beastwoman to testify against him. Duke didn't say anything. He stood there with a wooden expression, a perfect performance of what it meant to be a wooden man. He didn't need to say anything more. As a transmigrator, if he didn't even have the ability to profit from spoilers, then he couldn't be called a transmigrator who was familiar with history. He knew very well what Lang and the others were thinking, but it didn't matter if Lang and the others were in awe of him or his so-called teacher, the Hundred-Handed Reaper. Anyway, there was only one master and disciple. Whoever gained fame would definitely benefit Duque. There was only one thing on his mind now: how to successfully attack Karazhan and kill Mediv. As Duque had expected, Garona took out a book of evidence. It was a magic book that emitted a strange aura. The protruding cover of the dragon bone ring was glowing with faint arcane energy. The ripples spread out in all directions like ripples on water. All the ripples formed a net, which in turn absorbed the light and heat from the surroundings back into the magic book, forming a subtle small cycle. More importantly, for no reason, everyone felt the aura of fate. It was a very mysterious feeling. It was as if their future and all their hopes were on this book. However, as soon as they were more than a meter away from the book, they couldn't feel anything. This magic book told everyone that it was different from the others in this way. This is. The aura that flowed out from the magic book shocked even the court mage that Lang trusted the most. Garona handed the book to the guard, who then presented it to the court mage. Sure enough, Lang and the others saw that there was not only information about astral travel, but also a lot of information about the dark portal. Khadgar even used labels to annotate the key pages. The old court mage muttered to himself, "The information should be real, but my only question now is, there are at least 100,000 magic books in Karazhan's library. How could a mere Khadgar easily find this evidence?" Garona was confused. She couldn't understand the doubts of these humans. Didn't Khadgar say that as long as he took out this book, he would be able to convince the chief of the Storm clan that Mediv was the culprit? At this time Duque's voice suddenly rang out. Maybe this is a backup plan of the Tirisful Council. I don't believe that the old cunning fellows of the Tirisful Council would be so stupid as to let Medivh capture them all after receiving the warning, and not put up any effective resistance. Lang and Andoin both gave Duque a look that said, "You're really amazing." Duque was like a beacon of light in their lives. Every time they were lost, Duque would jump out and point them in the right direction. The old court mage nodded. It's very possible. According to the information I received, Medivh tricked the 6 of them into coming to Karazhan under the name of a powerful demon appearing in Karazhan, and he needed the council's help. But, how can we prove this? Can I take a look at the magic book? Duque asked. Lang nodded lightly. So, Duque held the thick magic book and started pacing left and right. Duque couldn't understand the magic book itself. It was encrypted in Elven language and even 99% of the elves wouldn't be able to understand it. He was waiting for an opportunity. As he paced back and forth, he moved the magic book closer to Khadgar's left arm. Then a miracle happened. A mysterious shadow in a black robe appeared in front of everyone in the meeting hall. He waved in Khadgar's direction, guiding him over. Khadgar's response was his left arm that was glowing. The old court mage muttered to himself, "Yes. That's right. This is it. The mark of the Tirisful Council. Only people who work for the council have a magic mark." It attracted the council's backup. Damn, could this be Aladi's aura? Aladi? Lang and Andoin's curiosity was about to explode. Chapter 95. With the old mage's explanation, Lang and the others finally understood who Aladi was. Aladi was the first guardian of the Tirisful Parliament, but the history of the Parliament was even older than him, because the original operation of the Parliament was not to train guardians, but to fight against demons who were attracted by human beings' abuse of arcane magic in a team way. After the humans learned magic from the High Elves, they did not know how to control themselves. Moreover, the newly established city of Dalaran was the most serious. Their endless casting of magic once again attracted the invasion of the demons. Completely unable to withstand the demons, the humans could only seek help from the High Elven Kingdom, Quell, the loss. When the High Elves saw that the actions of the humans could once again cause the world to be invaded, they immediately formulated a plan with the higher-ups of Dalaran, the Magacora's council at that time. Many powerful mages formed a secret organization to protect Azeroth and limit the abuse of magic. This was the origin of the Tirisful Council. As one of the earliest and most powerful guardians, Aladi had unfathomable magic power. If it was a message left by him, it would not be surprising at all. As for Khadgar, even though he was already a dead man, the glowing mark of the Tirisful Council on the inside of his left forearm still made Lang feel a little uncomfortable. That's right. Even though the former Medivh was also a guardian chosen by the Tirisful Council, how could a transcendent world guardian be compared to Khadgar, who was obviously sent to spy on Medivh? Even if it was proven that Khadgar's surveillance of Medivh was correct, it did not mean that Lang would accept Khadgar. Fortunately, Khadgar was dead. His death was not worthless. With the old mage's magic, Lang finally saw something that made him determined for the first time. A magic book of this level was a precious magic tool in itself. After the old mage injected arcane energy into it, a holographic projection appeared in mid-air. At first, what everyone saw were 2 huge planets connected by long black lines. No one reacted. Then, under the old mage's control, one of the ends kept zooming in, and zooming in. From outside the atmosphere to the huge bird's eye view to the trees, Lothar was the first to react. This area is the Swamp of Sorrow. What entered his vision was a low-lying swamp that was slowly turning into a desert. The water level was dropping at a visible rate. Countless colorful insects crawled out from every corner of the swamp and fled in all directions. The earth was changing color. It changed from the ugly black and green of the swamp to a lifeless crimson red. Even with his eyes, he could clearly feel that something was seriously deviating. Something was leaving this land with fear. Something else was descending. It was a power that made people feel uncomfortable just by looking at it, making it hard to breathe and stifling their moods. Just by looking at the aura of power, he felt as if the oxygen in his lungs was being squeezed out, and his body couldn't help but tremble. It was the power of evil. That was the power of a demon. This evil was corrupting and affecting the entire land. It was controlling everything and destroying everything. Even the uninhabited black swamp could not withstand this power, and it began to turn into a crimson, filthy desert. What's that over there? Bolvar suddenly pointed at a huge man-made object on the crimson land. The old mage used his magic as instructed, allowing the power of the spellbook to pass over there. The scene before them caused everyone in the meeting hall to lose their ability to speak. A huge door that was at least a dozen stories tall stood alone on the barren red land, and the door frame emitted an ominous dark green evil light. Groups after groups of orcs came out of the door in a mess, but they were scolded by the stronger orc leaders and chased into the nearby empty space. The material used to build the door could not be seen by sight, but it was clear that the design of the door was very much in the style of an ancient temple. At the top of the huge door frame was an extremely ferocious relief of a giant snake with its mouth wide open. On both sides of the door frame were relief sculptures of two hooded human mages wielding swords. As if it was specially displayed, Lang and the rest could see the face on the relief sculpture through the shadow of the hood that should have been shrouded in black fog. The two relief sculptures on the left and right had the same face. It was the face of the former guardian of Azeroth, Medivh. In the next moment, the stone relief sculpture of Medivh seemed to come to life. No, it was completely the will of Medivh descending. The projection of Medivh's head, which was as large as a carriage, appeared in the air of the meeting hall through Aladi's spellbook. Sargeras' voice sounded in the meeting hall. Oh, that's amazing. I didn't expect you to investigate to this extent. It was still the smiling Medivh, the same radiant expression. The only difference was that his eyes were filled with evil black flames. Those were the eyes of the Demon King, Sargeras. For those who were weak, just looking at that gaze was enough to freeze their blood vessels. As Lang's personal guards, these guards should not lack courage. But Lang was horrified to find that more than half of the guards in the meeting hall had been frightened to the point of paralysis. The rest of them were also rather weak. There were only a handful of people in the hall who could withstand the aura of fear of the demon net. Demon, who are you? What do you want? Although King Lang's voice was a little shaky, he pulled out his sword after all, and stood in front of the projection of the Demon King with Anduin and Bolvar. Nothing, I've done what I wanted to do. Since the dark portal has been opened, I'll quietly enjoy the ugliness of you humans, elves, and dwarves being slowly destroyed by the orcs in Karazhan. Watching you walk step by step towards destruction in despair and fear, my mood is incomparably good. There is nothing more ironic than taking the superpower of your guardian and destroying you instead. Medivh, who was under the control of Sargeras, let out a frightening laugh. Seeing their old friend under the control of the demon showing such madness, Lang and Anduin felt like vomiting. The projection of Medivh's head turned into a projection of his upper body. He opened his arms and his voice was like the roar of a tsunami, echoing throughout the entire meeting hall and even the entire storm fortress. The destruction can no longer be stopped. You ants cry and howl. Cry and beg. Kneel at my feet and beg for my mercy. Then you will still have to die. Suddenly a young voice was heard. Nonsense, as long as I get rid of you I can close the dark portal. Chapter 96. Sargeras was delighted. His plan was about to succeed. No, to him it was already a success. As far as he knew, there was nothing that could stop the power of the demons from invading the world of Azeroth. The strongest guardian, Astral Mage Medivh, was his possession. The Tirisful Council that was in the way was almost wiped out. The previous guardian, Aegwyn, who thought she had defeated him but was actually used by him, had already shed tears of failure in front of him. Dragons? He already had a complete plan to deal with those big lizards. Night elves? Those conservative, stone-like fellows would never move their butts when their territory was not invaded. Compared to direct invasion, using orcs, who were warlike creatures influenced by the power of the demons, was more like cutting flesh with a blunt knife. Sargeras licked his lips as if he had tasted the sweet taste of revenge, blood and pain that he had been longing for. When he saw the demonized green-skinned orcs kill every single human, regardless of whether they were male or female, old or young, armed or not, whether they were roaring angrily or crying, Sargeras was delighted. That fiery excitement flowed into his soul that had been helpless because of failure for a long time. That carefree feeling was enough to make every part of his evil soul sing with excitement. He believed that this plan that he had spent hundreds of years on was the most perfect. Because of this, he could calmly stay in the impregnable Karazhan and watch these ants die. But now there was actually a tiny ant saying, "As long as I get rid of you, I can close the dark portal." Sargeras didn't react for a moment. In the next moment he suddenly came to a realization. This tiny little fellow that had once slightly aroused his interest was shockingly right. That's right. The interworld teleportation of the dark portal was not particularly stable now. In fact, the entire dark portal was like a phone. One called and the other answered. As the caller, if something happened to Medivh, then the spatial coordinates would immediately be messed up. Sargeras' plan to let the orcs continuously attack the world of Azeroth would naturally be ruined. Of course, the premise was that he would really be killed by these ants. After coming to his senses, Medivh, who was controlled by Sargeras, immediately revealed an intriguing smile and let out arrogant laughter. Ha ha, ha ha, wah, what a joke. I'm dying of laughter. I've lived for countless years, and it's the first time I've seen someone as ridiculous as you, who doesn't know your limits, and yet can point out the crux of the matter. The muscles on Medivh's face twisted hideously, and his pair of red eyes clearly revealed evil. Yes, that's right. My dear little fellow, as long as you get rid of the Medivh that I control, the door of darkness will indeed close as you said. But do you ants have the courage and ability to do that? Hee hee. Let me tell you, death is not the end. If you are really stupid enough to come to Karazhan, then be prepared to have your soul tortured by me forever. As the last word fell, Medivh's projection disappeared. What followed was the screams of the court mage. Adams. Lang's eyes, which were always full of wisdom and courage, reflected the tragedy in front of him. On the old mage's robe, the protective spell that was supposed to be very powerful was automatically activated, and in the next moment it exploded. The well-dressed old mage immediately became like a beggar. This was just the beginning. Under the watchful eyes of everyone present, the old mage's two arms suddenly twisted in circles like a fried dough twist. Everyone in the meeting hall could clearly hear the old mage's blood-curdling screams and the sound of his muscles being torn and his bones being crushed. As if being kneaded by countless invisible hands, the old mage's limbs were all kneaded into his body, and his entire body began to turn into a meatball. But the old mage still didn't lose his life. His internal organs seemed to be protected by a special evil magic. Not only the old mage, but in the next second half of the two squads of royal guards in the meeting hall suffered the same fate. They were like iron objects attracted by a magnet, and they were sucked into the old mage's body by that inexplicable evil force. More than 10 people were all squeezed together and became an even larger meatball. Everyone seemed to be clear-headed and they were mumbling all kinds of things. Mum. Save me. No. Sir Lothar, give me a quick death. Kill me. Kill me now. This horrifying scene would make any normal person tremble in fear. Even the temperature of the air seemed to plummet. In the next moment, the bodies of these victims spontaneously combusted. The evil blue flames roasted their bodies and tortured their souls. Every survivor's clothes were soaked in cold sweat, because they could clearly see their comrades, their companions, the familiar faces and souls that had accompanied them for countless years, leaving their bodies and being burned by the demon's flames in midair. Sargeras had already left in laughter. Seconds and minutes ticked by. In the huge meeting hall, there was only the unpleasant smell of burnt corpses, the seemingly echoing screams, the dead air, and the extremely heavy breathing of the survivors. This was the demonstration of the Demon King, Sargeras. He used his supreme evil magic to show Lang and the others how powerful and terrifying he was. He was telling Lang to obediently die in despair and pain. This was the only ending he had arranged for Stormwind, the entire human world, and the entire world of Azeroth. Lang's body was trembling uncontrollably and beads of sweat rolled down his face. Lang didn't even know when the crown had fallen to the ground. He sat on the throne, exhausted, and couldn't even move a finger. Lothar quickly came back to his senses and he was shocked to find that someone was faster than him. Duque. Duque's face was also ashen, but the sharp light in his eyes told Lothar that he had made up his mind. Lothar and Duque's eyes met in midair. Great minds always think alike. If they didn't explode in silence, they would die in silence. They weren't people who would wait for death, so there was only one choice left. Both of them nodded at the same time and said in unison, "Your Majesty." Please allow us to lead an army to attack Karazhan. Chapter 97. Upwind Path. As a passageway between the quiet and dark twilight forest and the reed-filled swamp of sorrows, Upwind Path was obviously the so-called choke point. It was different from the future. In the Upwind Path of the future, if you had to find something here apart from the barren soil, there were only the wandering undead and the simple-minded upwind ogres. Only they could thrive in this dead land. The current Upwind Path was far less gloomy and desolate than in the future. On the contrary, it was a valley full of birds and flowers. Karazhan, which emitted strange blue arcane energy ripples, was located in the south of Upwind Path. Surrounded by mountains, the huge and towering steeple was still the focus of everyone's attention. Karazhan was very tall. Before Duque transmigrated, it was at least a tower with more than 20 floors. Because the slender and sharp wizard tower was too tall, there were a total of 6 cylindrical subtowers surrounding the main wizard tower in a hexagonal shape. They were the so-called flying buttresses. Flying buttresses, also known as buttresses, were auxiliary facilities used to share the pressure of the main wall. They were somewhat similar to the Gothic architecture before Duque transmigrated. They exposed the originally solid buttresses that were covered by the roof and called them flying buttresses. The subtowers of Karazhan used double arch bridges to increase the bearing capacity of the flying buttresses. They also added steeples to the flying buttresses to improve their balance. In addition to making Karazhan's wizard tower taller, there were also incomparably complicated carvings on it. These carvings imbued with magic power not only made the wizard tower look lighter, more beautiful and taller, but also had powerful defensive and counterattack abilities. As long as Rakazan's master, Medivh, wanted it, even if the entire dragon race was killed, he could teach the dragons a lesson in minutes. It was this mage tower that gave Sardra's unparalleled confidence. At the highest level of Karazhan, Medivh, who was possessed by Sardra's, sat on a throne made of solid arcane energy, revealing a playful expression. Unfortunately, most of my power can't enter this world. Well, it doesn't matter. It's fun to be close in strength. It is this kind of torturous process of giving hope to ants and then destroying their hope again that is worth slowly recalling in the future. Medivh gently raised his hand. Inside a crimson crystal prism, a lonely and helpless young soul was slapping the crystal wall. Bang bang bang. Khadgar, the former and only student of Medivh. Who would have thought that while Khadgar was dead, his soul would be imprisoned here? Instructor. Instructor. Wake up. Karthika roared. Sober. The Medivh revealed a mocking smile. Idiot, I've always been sober. Let me tell you something. I found out early on that you were a spy sent by the Tirisful Council. It was I who made the decision to influence the will of the Medivh, making him approve of you and accept you as his disciple. Khadgar's face instantly paled. Why did I accept you? Do you think it's loneliness? Wrong. That was because he was bored. I didn't have much to do while I was eroding Medivh's soul, so I was just looking for something to do. Originally, in my script, when the time was right, I would let you go back to Stormwind City. Then I would persuade Lothar or Urian to personally lead the troops here. In this Karazhan, the three of us who have known each other for many years would have the most tragic and cruel battle. Do you know why I changed my mind? Sardras lightly roasted Khadgar with a wisp of soul flame. Khadgar, who was in the form of a human soul, had a pained and confused expression on his face. You're too boring. You didn't surprise me at all. That little guy named Duque is different. Not only is he talented, but he's also full of possibilities. He surprised me and I'm very happy. So I chose him to assist Lothar or Urian as my challenger, not you. Ignoring Karthika's stupefied and dejected expression, Sardras lightly tossed the crystal that imprisoned Karthika's soul to some unknown corner. Lightly tapping his forehead, Sardras controlled Medivh to observe the changes within Karazhan with Mage's Eye. Karazhan, which had once exuded an aura of mystery and scrolls, was now becoming evil. The servants who had once served Medivh, as well as many people who had tried to find out what had happened to Karazhan. They had Lothar's elite spies, mercenaries and even nobles. They gathered in the lower hall of Karazhan's mage tower in a daze. Under the effects of the evil demonic power, their bodies were undergoing some strange changes. In Stormwind Stronghold, on a balcony facing the barracks, King Lang's face was full of hesitation and pain. Anyone who saw Lang's handsome face would feel that Lang was about to cry. His golden hair had lost its radiance of confidence. Instead, it was replaced by a gloomy, almost remorseful voice. The queen walked over lightly and held onto Lang's arm. "My dear, didn't you tell me before? Instead of doing nothing and regretting it, why not regret it after you've done it?" Lang's voice was choked with sobs. But that could very well be the legendary demon king Sargeras. Is Sargeras invincible? Has Sargeras never failed? The queen seemed to be implying something. He suddenly thought of the legendary war from 10,000 years ago. Although 10,000 years was definitely too long for humans with short lifespans, there were still many living fossils called elves who had lived for 10,000 years. Many night elves and high elves were now witnesses of that time. Lang suddenly felt much better. Indeed, Sargeras has been defeated before. The queen was resolute. Since he can be defeated once, he can be defeated a second time. But Andoan. Lang wanted to continue, but he met the queen's bright and hopeful eyes. It was as if she was reminding him to recall the scenes that had happened before. Yes, that's right. Just after Sargeras's will retreated, Andoan and Duque joined forces to remonstrate. "Your Majesty, we have no way out. Do we not resist and be slowly tortured to death or fight to the death?" "Choose. Your Majesty," Duque was almost roaring. "But if the resistance fails, the people of Stormwind." Bolvar came to his senses as well. He took a step forward and knelt on one knee. His firm voice shook one's soul. "Your Majesty, even if the resistance still brings destruction, then before we step into the gates of hell, we can at least tell the people without regret that we tried our best. Instead of hiding under the bed and shivering like a coward, becoming the joke of the demons." Chapter 98. The combination of Andoan, Bolvar, and Duque was very interesting. In Lang's opinion, they were the typical loyal, important, and good ministers. However, it was precisely such a miraculous combination that gave unanimous advice. Lang couldn't help but nod. Yes, since there was no other way, why not fight to the death? Recalling all this, Lang suddenly came to a realization. Yes, I was cowardly. I was intimidated by Sargeras. But I swear this will be the last time in my life that I will be cowardly. Lang's fingers pinched the railing of the balcony so hard that it was as if he wanted to leave 5 fingerprints on the white jade railing. The queen smiled brightly and gently pointed behind Lang. Lang looked back and immediately saw William, who was hiding beside the pillar at the balcony entrance. "Lang, that's right. A king should pass on his courage and virtue to the next king." The king and queen waved their hands together and called the current little prince, the future King William Rin, over. "Child, I want to tell you a story about courage." Leyland picked up the young William and said, "Let me tell you a story about courage." Lang told William, who didn't quite understand what had happened not long ago. William especially admired Andoan, so William asked curiously, "Father, why did Uncle Lothar and Brother Marcus risk their lives and not you?" Lang was slightly stunned, and then a gentle smile appeared on his face. "Child, in this world, everyone has their own responsibilities. There are people who shoulder the future of millions of people, who are responsible for the safety of the people's lives and property, and who seek hope and salvation for the people. These people are the nobles, and the top of the nobles is the king." Little William said in a childish voice, "Father, you are the king." "Yes. There are also people who will stand up when the whole world is in danger, and fight against evil with their weak strength. Most of them would fail and die miserably. But there will always be a small number of people who will miraculously obtain the final victory. Therefore, everyone will call these people who have gathered courage, wisdom, and luck heroes." There was a hopeful look in young William's eyes. "Then, is Uncle Lothar a hero?" Lang hugged William tightly and tears welled up in his eyes. He said emotionally, "I don't know, but every inch of my heart is praying for your Uncle Lothar. I hope that Lothar will become a hero and return in triumph. If he succeeds, even if I, the king, am to be buried under the glory of his hero, I am willing." At the same time, a group of cavalry was advancing rather quickly in Twilight Forest. The Twilight Forest was different from any other forest. The strange mist lingering above the forest all year round made it seem as if the entire forest had fallen into an eternal night. Sunlight could hardly penetrate the treetops and reach the ground, so most of the time visibility in the forest was extremely poor. Even pedestrians walking in the forest had to carry a torch. Under such circumstances, galloping on a horse would be courting death. The group of people only let the horses trot at a small pace. Lothar, who was leading the group, raised his right fist, and the cavalry immediately pulled on the reins to raise their horses' heads. As the horses did not gallop fast, they completed the entire deceleration process in 2 to 3 steps. Take a break, Lothar instructed. He jumped off his warhorse agilely, handed the horse over to his attendant, and walked to the back of the group. Almost at the back of the group, he saw Duque, who looked like he was having a toothache. Hey, my little hero, looking at you now. It's hard for me to associate you with the young hero who was so generous in the meeting hall and didn't even bat an eyelid in the face of death. Duque grimaced in pain. What could he do? How could a transmigrator, a university student who grew up in the city, have the opportunity to ride a horse? Even after he transmigrated, he had found time to learn it. However, short-term training was completely different from riding a horse for a long distance. Horses were living creatures. Even if they had muscles on their backs to slow down the impact, they still could not compare to a small car with shock absorbers on a flat road. The jolts and the continuous galloping made Duque feel as if his internal organs had shifted. It was not an exaggeration. On the first day, Duque almost vomited last night's dinner. In just 2 days they crossed nearly 300 kilometers of forest trails in the entire Elven Forest and entered the Twilight Forest. One had to know that this was not a modern highway before he transmigrated. Many of the trails were not even muddy roads. They were narrow paths that only hunters would take. At least 5 horses broke their legs because of the journey and had no choice but to give up. 2 cavalrymen almost broke their necks. The only good thing was that after entering the Twilight Forest, the speed of the horse slowed down and Duque could catch his breath. Faced with Lothar's question, Duque panted heavily and glared at Lothar. Bastard, laugh if you want. Don't give me a chance to laugh back. Lothar laughed and helped Duke off his horse, almost lifting him with his hands. Lothar's elite soldiers were busy in an orderly manner, either arranging sentries, feeding the horses, or standing in a circle vigilantly. They took out their canteens and sipped from them. Of course, many people looked at them with strange eyes. Because this combination was too strange. A knight, a mage, and a female orc. No matter how many times he looked at this combination, it was strange. Human, you're too weak. In the tribe, a weak existence like you is not even fit to be a laborer, Garona said mercilessly. This strange orc woman was straightforward. If it came from someone else's mouth, it would be sarcastic. But she only felt that it was natural. Duque could not help but sigh at the magic of fate. Sure enough, after some communication, Lang and Lothar, just like in history, readily chose to accept Garona. After asking a lot about the orc tribe, they agreed to let this powerful female orc, who was familiar with the terrain of Karazhan, join the assault team. Duque rolled his eyes at Garona. Come on, most of us human mages are like this. Actually, Duque wanted to say that the pharaoh here were all pampered. Unfortunately, Garona gave Duque a knowing blow. She showed a puzzled expression. But us orcs, whether warlocks or shamans, are much stronger than you. Duque sighed. Sure enough, the styles were different. There was no way for their brain waves to intersect. But after this, if he didn't have to become a ghoul, he really had to consider training his body. Azeroth. All the famous women were definitely better at fighting than the other. If he was too weak, he really couldn't pick up girls. Lothar suddenly asked in a low voice, "What do you think our chances of beating Sargeras are?" Duque raised 2 fingers, not the V that represented victory, but 20%, and this is based on the premise that the soul of your old friend Medivh has not been completely annihilated. Chapter 99. Duque wasn't the type of person who was extremely adventurous. Duque wouldn't gamble with his life or anything like that. But gambling with his life became gambling with his moral integrity. That had a different meaning. In fact, when Sargeras descended upon the meeting hall of the Storm's stronghold, a few lines of words appeared in Duque's system notification. Important human nature, moral integrity, choice. In the eyes of the Demon King Sargeras, you're just a slightly interesting ant. But you who are familiar with history, realize that this may be a chance to change your fate. If you're really lucky and can force Sargeras into a corner and save the Demon King when he's about to lose, the system has determined that you have an 87% chance of transforming yourself into a powerful demon when you're conscious, and become one of the commanders of the Burning Legion. Of course, if you can help Andrew and Lothar successfully kill Medivh and make Sargeras scram back to the abyss, then you'll undoubtedly become the hero of the entire world of Azeroth. According to the calculations of this system elf, you have a 999% chance of restoring all the missing moral integrity and soul power. You'll completely get rid of all possible negative soul states. The system didn't say what the outcome would be if he failed to challenge Medivh, but Duque could guess it. Dying under the fangs of a wild boar and dying in front of the Demon King were two completely different concepts. Just like in the future, the knights who died in the Scourge army would often be transformed into Death Knights. Falling into the hands of Sargeras, his soul was really, Duque had always thought of himself as immortal. He didn't have the Virgin Mary's spirit to save the world, nor did he have the violent tendencies to do evil and destroy the world. Since he had transmigrated, he began to adapt to this world. The Martians and the Death Seekers fought, and many people died on both sides, and your friends and family fought with the violent and evil orcs, and many of your friends and family died. These were two completely different concepts. Not to mention a human, even he would feel heartache when a cat or dog that he had raised for a long time died. That was why, even though the history of Azeroth had been changed beyond imagination, especially when Khadgar, who was supposed to be the winner, had died, Duque could not bear to see Lothar go to Karazhan alone to die. No, it should be said that from the moment Sargeras arrived arrogantly in the meeting hall, Duque felt as if he had been struck by a bolt of lightning, and he didn't like Sargeras at all. No matter what, Duque was already deeply involved with Stormwind and even the entire world of Azeroth. Moreover, Duque was definitely unwilling to see the Burning Legion do whatever they wanted. Duque thought to himself, Khadgar, I'll make up for your share. Lothar didn't know what Duque was thinking. On the contrary, when Lothar heard Duque say that the success rate was no more than 20%, his face lit up. That's Sargeras we're talking about. As long as the success rate isn't 0, I'm already very happy. He slapped Duque's shoulder with his powerful palm. Not bad, young man. You actually thought the same as me. I'm starting to think that bringing you along was a wise decision. At least you're much more reliable than those court mages. When I see them, I always feel that these inflexible and dogmatic fellows will just stand there and compete with Medivh in terms of magic, and then be tortured to death one by one. Duque smiled but didn't say anything. He knew that Lothar's words were a joke. Of course, the most important thing was that on the battlefield, Stormwind was at a complete disadvantage in terms of magic. The orc warlocks were much more terrifying than Duque had imagined. There were many things that Duque couldn't reveal too much about. This caused the Storm royal family's mages to be at a great disadvantage when fighting against these warlocks that they had never seen before. In a sense, warlocks who had more strange methods and could wear down their energy consumption were the nemesis of mages. The appearance of Cerberus, who specialized in countering mages, made the pharaoh's scalp go numb. Due to the death of one of Stormwind's 2 Morningstar mages, the strongest court mage by Lang's side, Stormwind was short on manpower. However, mages were necessary. Without them, if the enemy warlocks attacked, even if they only used fear to kill an officer in the human army, the entire battlefront would collapse. This was a vicious cycle. In any direct confrontation without mages, military formations would easily collapse. With mages, when mages lost in a battle of magic, they would either die or flee. When the orc warlocks had free hands, they would still be defeated. In the entire Elven Forest, there were battles of resistance and pursuit. Could be said that the humans were being pushed back step by step. The entire Stormwind Kingdom was permeated with an atmosphere of sadness and despair. However, it was under such circumstances that Noxus led his elites to attack. It was not that Duque had not asked these soldiers how they felt when faced with such a death mission. However, there was only one answer. For Azeroth, Duque saw smiles and saw hearts that were willing to die for their country and their people. Their voices echoed in Duque's chest and even in the skies of the human kingdom. It was like a lingering echo, echoing in Duque's ears over and over again. It was not an oath, but it was more touching and firmer than any oath in this world. Duque felt his blood being ignited by some kind of passionate flame, and it was incomparably hot. Faced with Noxus's theory of winning, Duque suddenly clapped his hands and said loudly, "Those who don't have missions, please come over here. I have something to announce." Noxus was a little curious, but he did not stop Duque and nodded slightly. Immediately, a few adjutants waved their hands, and the elite knights quickly surrounded them. Duque stood on a big rock so that most people could see him. What you're going to face is also a group of opponents that exceed your imagination. Demons. So, the first thing I hope you do is forget the military rules that Noxus taught you and learn what it means to be flexible. Duque's words caused a silent uproar and almost all the soldiers looked at Noxus. Noxus smiled instead of being angry. Go on, the soldiers I chose are the most intelligent apart from loyalty and skill. As long as it helps us win, I don't mind you challenging the military rules I set this time. Duque nodded and continued, the enemies you're going to face are all far stronger than you are, and they control mysterious powers that you can't imagine. What strict military formations are synonymous with sending food to your death. Forget about your formations and military manuals. Avoid all the dazzling energy bodies and look for opportunities to stab your sword into the opponent's back or anything that looks like the opponent's core. Chapter 100. After walking out of the twilight forest, the sky was once again reflected in their field of vision. After going through the torment of darkness in the twilight forest, he felt much better on the rugged headwind path. After walking for 2 days in a row, they finally couldn't find a suitable campsite on the third day because it was too close to Karazhan. As night fell, the assault team simply spent the night on the path by the cliff. On one side was a steep mountain wall and on the other was a bottomless cliff. Lothar had no choice but to let the team of more than 200 people form a long snake. If Sargeras gets a group of his men to attack us here, we'll be finished, Andoin said to Duque. Duque smiled. Would you run tens of kilometers just to hit a mosquito? If he really underestimates us to that extent, that would be great, Andoin said. He will, because even though Sargeras has fallen, he's still a creation titan. To him, it's already a grievance to be able to hide in Mediva's body. He won't have the leisure to deal with us. Titans. A race of creation with divine power. About 150,000 years ago, the Titans formed the Pantheon and began their journey of creation. Sargeras was the Titan warrior who was responsible for defeating many evil creatures during the journey of creation. The Pantheon visited planet Azeroth, and after setting up many laboratories and creating their own servants, they set the order for the entire system to develop on its own before leaving. Later, a group of extremely powerful special parasitic creatures invaded the Titans' laboratory in Azeroth. They ruled the chaotic elements there and became the leader of the planet, the Ancient Gods. The army of the Ancient Gods grew stronger and stronger. While they ruled over Azeroth, they also infected many of the Titans' creations and servants, turning them from inorganic creatures to organic creatures. This was known as the Curse of Flesh and Blood. About 25,000 years ago, Sargeras betrayed the Pantheon Council, created the Burning Legion, and began his burning expedition with the purpose of destroying the experimental results of the other Titans. It was precisely because Sargeras was a Titan that he was destined to be proud and arrogant. Duque said slowly, arrogance is born from the heart. When victory has become a habit, when you are so powerful that you can crush all the weak creatures, your arrogant heart can no longer tolerate any other opinions. For Sargeras, stealing Mediva's body, killing the guy from the Tirisful Council, and defeating Aegwynn was already the limit of his condescension. So before we enter Karazhan, we don't need to worry too much. Lothar nodded. I hope so. That was how Duque comforted Lothar. However, he was still a little uneasy. He kept praying in his heart, hoping that the history of Mediv being defeated would repeat itself. After all, he and the Stormwind Kingdom and even the entire world of Azeroth were inextricably linked. He looked up at the starry sky and saw a strange red light coming from the direction of the Swamp of Sorrows. Even at night, this evil red light still radiated a light that was thousands of times brighter than the moonlight. The red light and the darkness of midnight intertwined, as if a war of erosion and plunder was taking place. The stars above the elven forest were dim, as if they had been forced into a dead end by a huge dark red shadow. The star of storms standing in the northwest seemed to be falling at any time. And all the hopes of the entire kingdom were on Lothar, Garona, and him, Duque, these 3 tiny meteors. Would they be meteors that flashed by, or would they soar into the sky and shine brilliantly across the entire starry sky? Duque didn't know either. In a trance, Duque fell asleep. When he woke up again, it was already morning. Yes. The plan of attack that he had set with Lothar was to attack at dawn. When the group of people reached the outside of Karazhan, They were surprised to find that the light of the rising sun was rising from behind Karazhan. Like the flames of dawn, it was dispelling the haze entrenched in Karazhan. Lothar turned to Duque and Garona with a confident smile. Is this a sign that we are about to dispel the darkness and bring light? It's a good sign, isn't it? Garona rolled her eyes at Lothar. I never believe in luck, I only believe in my own strength. The strong will win. Both Andoin and Duque ignored the straightforward female beastman. Instead, Duque subconsciously asked, Are we going through the front door or the back door? Andoin was puzzled. Back door? Are you talking about the platform provided for visitors to land on with griffins? Please, even though Medivh knows that we are likely to come, we can't just swagger over in a flock of griffins, can we? Who knows if we will be used as targets and shot down in midair? No, not that back door. Duque was a little worried. He didn't know how to explain that he knew about the back door in Karazhan from the game. However, there were more than 200 people on Lothar's side. Although they had agreed to attack, they couldn't possibly charge in slowly from the front door, right? If they did that, even if Sargeras was a hibernating bear, he would be woken up. Duque didn't know how Khadgar, Andoin and Garona had easily reached the highest level of Karazhan in the history, and fought with Medivh. Duque only knew that if it was Karazhan in the game, it would be so big that most first-timers would get lost. Remember, that was only the game version of Karazhan. In the real world of Azeroth, which had been magnified countless times in the Elven Forest, only God knew how big Karazhan was. Karazhan looked big enough from the outside, but the problem was that the Mage Tower was something that couldn't be described by science. The space inside the Mage Tower was often larger than it looked, because the Mage Tower would integrate all kinds of space magic. Besides, the owner of Karazhan was the astral mage Medivh. Now that Medivh was Medivh controlled by Sargeras, it was far from the Karazhan that was full of ghosts in Duque's memory. In the game, the experience gained from defeating the boss was likely to be useless. It was best to avoid fighting with the small boss and defeat Medivh directly. Follow me. Duque knew that it was useless to explain, so he simply led the way. A mage had many servants and followers, so there were many houses outside Karazhan. But now these houses were all empty. Duque led Lothar and the assault team, and directly ignored the main gate of Karazhan. They crossed the river on the right side of the main gate that was not rushing. Then they pushed open the unlatched door and entered a 3-story house. Duque turned left with familiarity and saw a staircase. He walked up the stairs, and after a while Lothar found a bridge that was very high above the ground. On the other side of the bridge was a secondary tower of Karazhan. However, in front of the secondary tower there was a locked iron door. Damn, how did you know? Lothar looked as if he had seen a ghost. Duque shrugged. Well, here's the problem. I don't know how to pick a lock. I came here purely to try my luck. Now we can return to the main gate. With a click, the sound of a lock being unlocked came from behind Duque. Garona smiled. The lock is open, and then? Pfft, Duque choked. Chapter 101. How important was the back door in Karazhan? It was hard to answer this question. Duque didn't know what the world of Azeroth, which was 80% similar to the world of Warcraft that he knew, would be like. He only knew that from ancient times until now, anyone who fought their way in through the front door was either extremely powerful or extremely stupid. In this world, the higher the status of the Mage Tower, the higher the Mage Tower. Medivh must be at the top of the tower. Okay, here's the problem. According to the game, Karazhan had 12 bosses of various sizes. Of course, this wasn't the ruins of Karazhan that were filled with ghosts, immortals and demons after Medivh died in the game. Many of the monsters and bosses that Duque had imagined wouldn't appear. However, looking at the house where the human servants lived in front of the Karazhan Mage Tower, he could see that nothing good would come from the front door. Demonic humans, or monsters summoned by Sargeras from another world. No matter which it was, he was sure that entering from the front door would lead him directly into Sargeras' playground. This was a battle with a great disparity in strength. Even with 2 hero-level characters, Noxus and Garona, on his side, they still couldn't defeat Medivh, who had the advantage of the Mage Tower. The most important thing was to reduce the number and intensity of the battles and try to fight Medivh in his strongest state. According to the game, going through the back door meant that at least half of the bosses were avoided or killed. In this case, it was very advantageous. Duque glanced at Garona, who was smug and had a praise me expression, and he suddenly lost his temper. Noxus didn't know if he was being honest or not, but he appropriately expressed his surprise and amazement. "Oh my God! How did you do it? Just now one of my best rogues winked at me and told me that he couldn't handle it." Garona put her hands on her hips. "Hee hee. When you've been imprisoned countless times and tried to escape from the cage countless times, no lock in the world can stop you, no matter if it's a magic lock or an ordinary lock." Duque rolled his eyes. "If you're so awesome, why don't you fly?" It turned out that he had reached the master level in hidden room escape. Lothar drew his sword. "Okay, next question. Duque, where does this door lead to? Do you have any information or leads?" Duque was embarrassed. "Do I have to recite the name of the boss in the game for you?" Duque could only shrug. "I don't know. Even my teacher only told me that there is a back door in Karazhan. At least we can bypass the stable, the servants' rest area, and the reception area for nobles." At this time Reginald Windsor stepped forward and asked, "What's the point of avoiding these areas?" Duque rolled his eyes again. Yes, Duke had brought Windsor just as he had in the history. Even though history had greatly deviated, aside from the fact that Khadgar had been killed, Duque still tried his best to restore the history of the weak defeating the strong. Of course, Windsor had changed from a soldier of Lothar to a follower of Duque. This was also a big change. Duque still believed that just as Lothar should have been blessed by the goddess of fate, Windsor should not have died in this place. Windsor was still relatively young now, so Duque could only patiently explain. Originally in Karazhan, there were hundreds of servants helping to take care of the entire mage tower. But now they are all gone. The most likely reason is that they have all been turned into demons by Sardras, or demonized creatures. Bypassing these areas is also to reduce unnecessary casualties. Of course, a feint is still necessary. "What is a feint?" Garona suddenly asked. Duque slapped his forehead. There was a female orc with the wrong brainwaves. "How troublesome." Windsor explained to Garona. Duque turned to look at Lothar. "If we go through the back door, I have a 70% chance of avoiding more than half of the enemies and killing my way to Mediv within an hour. But nothing is absolutely safe. You are the commander and the decision is in your hands." "Okay, the main force will go through the back door," Lothar agreed decisively. Lothar's straightforwardness made Duque, who had prepared a bellyful of excuses, a little stunned. Lothar patted Duque on the shoulder, his hearty and extremely rich face full of magnanimity. "Have some confidence in yourself. In the field of mystery you are the expert. Since you have used your actions to prove your loyalty to the kingdom and to humans, what's wrong with us outsiders putting our lives in your hands? Anyway, I will be satisfied if we can achieve some results against Sardras. Okay, then I will cross the line. Everyone listen to me, we will set up like this." At the highest level of Karazhan, Mediv was sprawled out on a deck chair. If anyone saw it, they would be surprised to find that there were dozens of light screens floating in the void around Mediv. Each light screen had a different picture and many of them had nothing to do with the world of Azeroth at first glance. The scenes on these light screens were like movies that had been played in 10 times faster speed, as if the entire river of time had been accelerated. However, no matter which picture it was, there was the same theme: destruction and killing. In different corners of the universe, the Burning Legion was wantonly destroying, endlessly spreading death. Sardras, who was attached to Mediv, found that his entire spiritual sea was full of the same wailing and begging. Sardras Mediv frowned. He was a little tired of it. With a light snap of his fingers, the entire spiritual space became quiet. Only the sound of chaos magic surging through the void and transmitted from his body was left. This sound was so strong, like the whistling of a wild wind. Even though his body was sealed and dormant, Sardras could feel how wonderful his condition was. Sardras didn't even need to move a finger. His vision crossed the space of Karazhan, and his eyes reflected the entire aperture on planet Azeroth. This aperture emitted a bright and mysterious brilliance, rejecting the direct invasion of all pure-blooded demons. However, everything changed because of the invasion of the orcs. Sardras could see the orcs who had drunk the demon's blood, crossing the void and entering the world of Azeroth. As the orcs entered, the power of the Circle of Light began to weaken at a rate that was undetectable to the naked eye. Not enough. Not enough. Not enough. I need more demonized orcs to pollute this land. Sardras muttered to himself as he tried to think of a way to speed up the countdown to the destruction of this world. Suddenly he sensed an intruder. Chapter 102. Draw your swords. The future Marshal Reginald Windsor's voice was still childish. He did not know why Duque had asked him to lead this elite troop of 200. He also did not know why this troop, which made up more than 90% of the assault team, was used as a feint. He only knew that Duque, who had become his master, and Anjouan Lothar, whom he admired the most, had placed their utmost trust in him. This trust was very heavy. "I'll leave my men to you," Lothar said. "A soldier who doesn't want to be a marshal is not a good soldier. Reggie, I have high hopes for you, but you also need to prove yourself. This is your chance." Duque patted his shoulder. Windsor was already very grateful to have the honor of fighting for the kingdom in ruins. He was sure that he did not follow the wrong person. Duque, who seemed to be mysterious, was actually a great hero of the kingdom. Now that he heard their trust in him, Windsor's eyes almost teared up. The appointed time had arrived. In the first rays of the morning sun, the long sword was raised high, bringing with it the brilliance of the sun, like an arc of flames. Enchanted weapon, Demon Slayer. This mid-tier enchantment could permanently enchant a close-range weapon, giving it a chance to stun a demon and deal extra damage. To be honest, this was not a weapon that a soldier could have. Even the chief swordsman of the noble families might not have one. However, the rich and capricious Duque found an enchantment master and enchanted all the swords used by the 200 warriors with Demon Slayer. Windsor didn't know how powerful the enchantment was, but he could sense a holy aura from it, which delighted every warrior. Windsor's figure stood proudly in the morning light. The elite warriors of Stormwind all looked at him and raised their long swords at the same time. Light filled the air, and the cold glint of the blades was faintly discernible. It was like the first light of dawn spreading across the dark land, driving away the darkness. Charge. Bearing in mind Duque's repeated warnings, Windsor didn't advance in a strict military formation, instead using an even more disorganized charge. The battlefront began to push forward. Unknowingly, the pace of every soldier was quietly increasing, and their strides became larger. After a short 10 meters, almost every soldier was fighting to be the first to run. "For Azeroth. For His Majesty Rin. For my lover," the soldiers shouted messy slogans, but they quietly changed their formation in the midst of their charge. 8 warriors holding siege hammers used to break down doors had already reached the front line at some point. Quang Dang, the iron gate, which was as tall as 3 people, broke into pieces. Karazhan was not a fortress and there was no moat. Even the iron gate and wooden door at the gate were more for decoration. The defense of a mage tower never relied on external objects. Perhaps it could be said that they were able to successfully approach the gate of Karazhan because Sargeras ignored them. Rumble. The door also fell down. The brave warriors with torches in their hands killed their way in. Then, under the illumination of the fire and the torches inside the gate, they saw their enemy, Satyr. A demon with cracked hooves, unkempt goat legs, goat-like horns, razor-sharp claws, and a long lion's tail. The origin of Satyr could be traced back to the ancient war. Among the High Elves, there was a Kaldorii noble named Havis, who was Queen Azhara's most trusted and closest advisor. Havis was one of the main culprits who led the Legion into Azeroth, and as the ancient war progressed, he brought more and more suffering to his race. But he was finally defeated in an encounter with the young druid Malfurion Tempest. Malfurion had completely destroyed his sinful body. However, Sargeras felt that Havis still had value, so he resurrected him and became the first satyr in the world. As long as there was a strong enough demon curse and the target's will wasn't strong enough, satyrs could easily turn other creatures into satyrs. Although most of the satyrs' bodies had become inflated, and most of them were more than 2 meters tall, Windsor and the others could tell from the clothes that these satyrs had left that they were satyrs who had once served Medivh. Windsor's eyes narrowed slightly and only one word came out of his mouth. Kill. The assault force of Stormwind was like a flaming rocket, instantly breaking through the group of satyrs. Now that he was within close combat range, Windsor could even see the red flames flickering in the eyes of these purple-furred demons. What kind of chaos and madness was that? The warriors of Stormwind were heroic. As elites personally selected by Lothar, they couldn't help but feel nervous even when facing such an unknown opponent. But when they saw the young figure at the front of the team, they couldn't help but feel more courageous. At some point, Windsor, who was leading the charge, had become their flag. The satyrs screamed. Their sharp and unpleasant roars were enough to make anyone with a weak mind tremble. Windsor's sword was very steady. When he was 2 meters away from the first demon, a visible wave of flames burst out from the blade's edge, forming a blade wind in the air. In the blink of an eye, the entire sword's killing range more than doubled. The golden light of the sword was even more dazzling under the flickering flames. It split the dark void with a halo-like brilliance, sweeping across the first row of satyrs with a whoosh. Strangely, there was a burst of sound in the air. The row of satyrs who were 2 meters tall all became 1 meter tall. That was because their entire upper bodies had been sliced off. The impact of Demon Slayer completely blew away their broken upper bodies. Not every warrior who fought against the demons was as lucky as Windsor, but a sword enchanted by Demon Slayer often emitted a holy aura that was enough to shock the satyrs. The first wave of human soldiers were all unharmed. There's hope. In the face of these human soldiers who were armed to the teeth, these newborn satyrs were as weak as chicks that had just hatched. Even a slightly weaker warrior could kill these farmers and servants who had turned into satyrs in 3 rounds. Kill all the demons. As soon as Windsor finished shouting, he suddenly felt a shiver pass through his body. That feeling gave him goosebumps. Turning his head, he saw a red-skinned evil demon riding a flaming warhorse slowly appear at the wide entrance of the passage. The thunderous galloping of the horses, the squeaking of the air, and the scattering satyrs. Everything was telling Windsor that something was wrong. This guy in front of him was not to be trifled with. The guy suddenly said, "Come on, Midnight. Let's destroy this mob together." Chapter 103. If Duke could see this scene, he would definitely be so shocked that he couldn't close his mouth. Itumen the Hunter. The boss that should have become an undead in the future had now appeared as a demon. There was no way to find out where Itumen came from. As a beginner boss, he gave Windsor and the others a good show of strength. Itumen rode on an impressive monster. Its body was covered in hellfire, and its 4 hooves were so hot that they glowed red. Just by standing on the ground, the bluestone floor was scorched into small pits. Accompanied by a whooshing sound, the tall Hellwarhorse appeared in front of Windsor and the others. Even its nose and mouth were spewing flames filled with the smell of sulfur. It was taller than all the warhorses used by the heavy cavalry in Stormwind. It was easy to think that Midnight was a rhinoceros and not a nightmare beast from hell. When the nightmare beast's roar resounded throughout the first level of Karazhan, when its huge body was covered in flames, no one could stop it. Windsor then realized what Duque meant when he said, "Your responsibility is not light. If you can last for an hour, you will have completed the mission." Noxus had warned these new recruits countless times that on the battlefield, when facing the enemy, the first thing they had to overcome was the fear of death. If they could not face the fear of death directly, then they would only understand that they had been standing at the edge of the gates of hell the whole time. Otherwise, when your head fell to the ground, when you were smashed into meat paste by the huge momentum of the warhorse, when your vision was spinning wildly, when your consciousness quickly dissipated, when the fire of life extinguished, everything would be too late. Your life, your status, your friends, your loved ones, all of them would become history under that one strike. The world after death did exist. Countless undead and demons used their evil figures to prove this terrible ironclad fact. But once you died, you would no longer be you. In order to avoid this terrible situation, the first thing to do was to overcome your fear. It wasn't an easy task, especially in front of the Nightmare Warhorse with its own aura of fear. Many elite warriors showed fear on their faces. It was the performance of the Nightmare Warhorse, or the suppression of the terrifying will. That bone-deep fear completely froze their hearts and blood vessels. They were like lambs waiting to be slaughtered, their lives reaped by Itumen the Hunter and Midnight the Nightmare Beast. Strangely, Windsor was not afraid. He felt that something had awakened in his heart. It was something called courage. Heaven looks to the left, warriors look to the right. After witnessing the bravery of the Griffin Legion, Duque had said this more than once. From that day on, Windsor had always half understood what was said. But at this moment, Windsor understood. Everything in his field of vision was still the same color as before. The flames of hell and the cries of the Grim Reaper were still wantonly roaring. His comrade-in-arms not too long ago had perfectly demonstrated what it meant to leave the world forever. The fear of death spread rapidly, but Windsor didn't feel it at all. His heart was filled with nervousness. This nervousness didn't come from fear, but from a heavy sense of responsibility. It came from Andoan and Duque's trust. The comrades beside him weren't afraid of death. From the moment they'd accepted this mission, they'd already cast aside life and death. But Windsor at least hoped that even if they died, it would be a meaningful death. He wanted them to die on the path to victory. The situation was too chaotic and command was meaningless. Thus, Windsor decided to do it himself. He saw an opportunity. It was a moment that could not be missed. Just as the nightmare beast Midnight knocked away a warrior not far from Windsor at a speed that was hard to see with the naked eye, and just as Atuman the hunter was about to follow up with another slash, Windsor suddenly launched his charge. This wasn't an ordinary charge. This was the charge of a warrior. With a whoosh, Windsor slammed into the side of the nightmare beast, leaving behind a long afterimage. The momentum was so great that even the majestic nightmare beast couldn't help but stagger. Come, four-legged worm. Let's fight to our heart's content. Midnight understood human nature. Windsor's taunt made it very unhappy, but before it could react, a shield engraved with the emblem of the Stormwind Lion gave it a hard blow. Shield slam. The heavy blow made its mouth crooked. Ha! Atuman the huntsman followed up with a cleave, but it was parried by Windsor's enchanted sword, Demon Slayer, which could not have been more accurate. The situation of the battle suddenly changed. It was Windsor's brave battle that caused the unstoppable Atuman to fall into the siege of the elite warriors of Stormwind City, on the other side at the back door of Karazhan. Noxus, on the other hand, was a little anxious. After Duke ordered Windsor to attack, there was no movement on the other side. What are you waiting for? It wasn't that Lothar hadn't seen the mysteriousness of the pharaoh. For someone like Duque who refused to enter the back door and hid by the door, looking like he was eavesdropping, Lothar really couldn't figure out if Duque was really performing magic, or if he was simply eavesdropping like a thief. But what was he eavesdropping on? If it was a diversion, why hadn't he acted yet? Lothar's head was full of question marks. Out of trust in Duque, Lothar still didn't say a word. He waited near the back door with his 24 most capable men and the bored Garona. Not to mention Duque was really carrying out a big project. Eavesdropping. Diversion was a good strategy, but it depended on who it was used on. If it was used in a place where communication was inconvenient and alarm messages could only be transmitted in the most primitive way, diversion would definitely be successful. But this was Mediva's Karazhan. If it wasn't for Sargeras being too arrogant and lazy to even explore the wide area, or deliberately waiting for them to come, they wouldn't even be able to reach the edge of Karazhan. Entering Karazhan was like a mosquito sucking blood from a human body. It might not be felt in the short term, but it would definitely be felt after a long time. Duque was trying to find a way to turn a forceful attack into a surprise attack again. Duque wanted to verify a guess of his. An invisible ripple was spreading in all directions with the highest point of the Karazhan Wizard Tower as the center. The principle was like radar waves. Through active sonar, a circle of arcane energy rippled out, and when it hit something, there would be a weak ripple back to the highest point of the Wizard Tower. To the people of this world, this kind of principle was simply a fantasy. But for a transmigrator like Duque, it was nothing. Got it. Chapter 104. The unknown demonic energy fluctuated slightly, with different lengths between the peaks and troughs. It was not something that humans could control. Also, it was a language of Eridar, commonly known as the demonic language. This would definitely stump 99% of the mages in the world, but not Duque. That was because Duque had the system elf. This kind of unchanging question and answer every 5 minutes. Even though there were extremely complicated fluctuations, these fluctuations were unchanging. When the system elf repeatedly assured Duque that it could perfectly imitate it, Duque smiled at Lothar. I can use a little trick that only mages know to hide from Mediv for a while. I think before we get close enough to Mediv, no matter how many of his men we kill, he won't notice. Lothar's eyes lit up when he heard this. If he could get close to Mediv, he might have a chance. What was most afraid of? Being drowned by endless demons before they could see Mediv. He and his men were very strong. No matter how strong they were still human. As long as they were human, they would be tired and prone to mistakes. It could be said that the longer the battle dragged on, the more disadvantageous it would be for them. Duque's appearance directly reversed this point. Okay, come with me. Duque waved his hand. No, let's go together. Lothar held a shield in his left hand and a sword in his right. Duque suddenly noticed that Lothar's sword seemed to be fundamentally different from the one he usually held. It's an ancestral thing. But it should be quite useful, Lothar said casually. Duque's mouth opened wide. If he hadn't been barely able to control himself, he would have probably screamed. Who was Lothar's ancestor? The former ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, Thoradin the Great. An ancestral treasure sword? Wasn't that the Emperor's sword? As if he had seen through Duque's surprise, Lothar said indifferently, "It's not as mysterious as you think. However, taking this sword out at ordinary times will indeed provoke the nobles of the Stormwind Kingdom." Duque did not dare to ask any more questions. If he did, it would be Lothar's dark history. In fact, Duque couldn't understand why a descendant of Thoradin the Great would become a subordinate of House Rin. Duque brought Lothar and the others into Karazhan. Almost as soon as he stepped through the back door, Duque felt something was wrong. It was a feeling of chaos, as if time and space had been reversed. No matter how one looked at it, this was inevitable. In the primordial era, an unknown explosion occurred in the southern section of the Riedridge mountain range, forming a crater, which was the current upwind trail. The spacetime in the middle of the crater turned illusory, folded, and became a spacetime node in the universe, connecting many other worlds and the distorted void. Countless years later, the astral mage Medivh was attracted by the spacetime characteristics here. In order to study this place for a long time, he built a tower in the center of the node and settled down. This was today's Tower of Karazhan. King Lang of Stormwind granted this place to Medivh and gave him the title of Karazhan's master. After integrating the power of Medivh, the guardian of Azeroth, the Tower of Karazhan gradually merged with the spacetime node, and the tower itself became a part of this special spacetime. This folded and distorted spacetime was also the cause of Karazhan's illusions. Karazhan's illusions were not illusions or ghosts, but real fragments of the past and future. They were involved in the chaotic spacetime and appeared in places that should not be. So, in Karazhan there would be many unreasonable things. For example, all he could see now were books. There were all kinds of books, not just magic books but also a large number of humanities, geography and history books. But these were all visual illusions. Listen, follow me and step on a math book. Math book? Lothar was puzzled. If you don't want to fly to another planet the next moment, follow me. Duque carefully jumped on the books, scattered on the ground. If it wasn't for the system elf scan, he would have thought that these were just ordinary books. After the system scan, he was shocked to find that most of the ground here was actually an illusion. If he took one wrong step and was lucky, he might be able to return to Earth. If he was unlucky, that mutilated corpse of an unknown race over there ended up like that. Half of its body was cut off in a circular arc. The group of guys followed Duque, jumping left and right for a few minutes before leaving this area. Although it was a bit funny for a group of big men wearing armor and carrying long swords to jump around, this kind of deadly situation was really not funny. The only good thing was that it seemed that no one who came in was left behind. Then when Duque led the way through the illusion of a bookshelf, Duque's expression changed slightly. He saw a downward ramp. Below the ramp, there was a faint smell of sulfur. What? Did you think of something? Satyr. And it's the satyr that attracts imps. Duque almost blurted out Tristan Darkhoof's name. As a very powerful earth mage, Duque knew where his limits were. Although his casting ability had surpassed many sky mages, he was still essentially an earth mage. He didn't know what level he was in the original game. He only knew that Karazhan wasn't a good place for newbies to play. In a sense, he didn't know how many levels he had skipped to come to Karazhan. If it was simply a player from before he traveled to this world, he would really be looking for death. However, when the players fought here, it was only the players themselves. Duque came with 3 heroes and more than 200 elite warriors to explore. This feeling made Duque feel very uncomfortable. If the opponent this time wasn't Medivh, it would be a classic example of hugging someone's thigh. And it was Lothar, the perfect thigh. Is there anything to pay attention to? Lothar asked softly. It's best if it doesn't become a protracted battle. Because this summoning type of satyr, given enough time, he can easily create an army. I'll go first. It wasn't Lothar who spoke but Garona. At that moment Duque almost had a heart attack. Because he saw Garona, a half-orc with a straight line of thought, rush directly into the secret room where Darkhoof was at the speed of lightning. Follow her. Not only Duque but Lothar was also stunned. He knew that most orcs had the word brave engraved on their chests, but he didn't think that even a female half-orc like Garona could be so fierce. He was almost running as he followed Garona into the room that was filled with dim red light. Even the floor was covered with complicated red magic arrays. Chapter 105. The anticipated battle did not start immediately. Garona held a strange bone dagger in her hand. She was clearly hesitating, because in this large room that was more than 100 square meters, she saw a standard blonde human youth. He was a human who looked very similar to the human nobles she saw in the Storm Fortress. This made her extremely confused. Although her instincts told her that something was wrong, her rationality still took over her body. She stopped. The moment Duque saw this, he would rather Garona continue to be reckless. In the world marked by the system elf, this guy's head was clearly marked with a large red skull, and his race was marked as satyr. Kill him. Duque's shout seemed to be a little late. The blonde nobleman suddenly had a mocking expression on his face. He opened his mouth slightly and screamed. A crimson-red smoke came out of his mouth, followed by his eyes, nostrils and ears. In less than 2 seconds, the red smoke that seemed to have a life of its own turned into some kind of corrosive substance, melting the nobleman's facial features like molten wax and turning into a blurry human figure. Right in front of the 20 ambushers he transformed. An evil rune circle that emitted a foul smell wrapped around him, rejecting all external attacks. Duque and the others could only watch as this guy knelt down powerlessly and curled up on the ground. His skin turned red, and then, like a poisonous snake shedding its skin, the thing inside was peeled off from this lifeless, soulless human shell. The red runes that enveloped this guy suddenly exploded and shot in all directions. Duque only had time to cast a shield made of arcane energy before the strange runes reached him. This was not a particularly premeditated attack. The exploding runes were very messy. Unfortunately, there were still a few elite warriors who could not dodge in time and were affected. Even though their hands and feet were protected by sturdy armor, just a little bit of contact was enough to directly burn through the armor. When the runes touched them, they felt a burning sensation as if they were splashed with high-temperature molten steel. Naturally, there were also priests who entered with Noxus. Lothar was prepared to launch a surprise attack, so he didn't care if he was discovered. After the warrior hurriedly took off his gauntlets, the middle-aged priest tried to use the power of the holy light to dispel the red runes on the warrior's arm. However, he was shocked to find that his power was powerless. The highly corrosive runes spread out from the wound like a plague. Noxus's pupils constricted. He raised his sword and cut off a large piece of flesh from the victim's arm. The rest of the warriors were similarly dealt with. Everyone's expression changed. This was the most typical demonic power. Haha. Puny humans. Why did you come here to die? The red light faded and a satyr with a huge goat head appeared. Accompanied by a burst of arrogant laughter, a typical satyr appeared in front of everyone. Unexpectedly, the other party did not attack immediately. On the other hand, the red-skinned satyr bowed to Lothar in a nondescript aristocratic manner. He placed his left hand on his right chest and used his right hand to fling away the cap on his head. Then he bowed slightly and nodded. You must be Anduin Lothar, aren't you? I, Tristan Darkhoof, salute you, Tristan said in standard human language. Anduin noticed that this guy actually spoke with a very standard aristocratic accent of the Rotterdam Kingdom. Anduin's pupils couldn't help but constrict. Are you waiting for me? Waiting? No, this is just an accident. Seems that your little mage is quite strong. In fact, I didn't even feel your arrival before your orc scout sneaked into my room. However, since you're here, everyone except Sir Lothar can go to hell. More than one person noticed Tristan's subtle words. Obviously, everyone's life was meaningless to Sargeras except Lothar. I hate you. Garona didn't have the patience to listen to the satyr's nonsense. She immediately attacked. For the first time, Anduin and Duque witnessed Garona's attack with their own eyes. A series of cold lights suddenly burst forth. Garona's attack was so fast that Duque subconsciously thought of the term bullet screen. It was a bullet screen made up of countless hot weapons. The light and shadow left behind by the projectile clearly showed how fast Garona's attack was. Almost everyone on Lothar's side felt like they were in a dream. They all covered their hearts and asked themselves if they could withstand such an attack. Even Lothar, who had tried to fight with Garona before, was also shocked and doubtful. This female orc was too powerful. Garona wasn't short. She was 1.8 meters tall and even taller than many men. Despite her slender body, she was actually stronger than many human warriors in terms of muscle strength. Such a burly woman actually had agility and speed that exceeded most people's dynamic vision. Really surprised everyone. Such an attack actually couldn't achieve its full effect in one blow. On the floor that was full of runes, there were long traces of sharp weapons crisscrossing, some of which were already more than an inch wide. Those were the traces left by Tristan when he dodged Garona's fierce attack. This demon also had superhuman agility. However, Tristan Darkhoof was not an existence that could be easily beaten. He suddenly let out a low roar, and the room full of bookshelves suddenly felt like it was about to collapse. Many books fell from the bookshelves, and some green-blue imps that were only a little taller than a human's knees suddenly rushed out from behind the bookshelves. Not only the bookshelves, but in the void in the room and even on the roof, more than a dozen blood-red teleportation portals opened. However, the other side of the teleportation portals wasn't a good place with birds and flowers. It should be some kind of terrifying space full of evil. Countless imps rushed out of the teleportation portals, and without saying a word, they directly threw small fireballs at the human warriors in the room. For the sake of flexibility, Lothar's elite soldiers didn't choose the cumbersome tower shield. Most of them used the standard Storm City's zither-shaped shield. Obviously, this kind of shield was not enough to protect them from fireballs coming from all directions. Digga, a 28-year-old veteran soldier, joined the army at the age of 16. He had fought fishmen, killed gnolls, fought beasts and fought against orcs. As a warrior in the Golden Age, his experience could not be said to be not rich. However, when faced with the unknown mysterious attack, he was momentarily stunned. The fireball came at him at high speed, and the rapidly expanding light in his field of vision made him ready to close his eyes and wait for death. However, it was at this moment that a bright blue light suddenly flashed behind him. Chapter 106. Subconsciously, Digga raised his shield as he tilted his head. Coincidentally, he saw a strange, illusory white palm made of arcane energy appear not too far away from his left shoulder. This mage hand, that was as nimble as a human's hand, seemed to have captured all of Digga's attention, causing him to forget about the danger and everything else in the world. The only thing left in his vision was this hand made of arcane energy. From the palm of the magician's hand, a series of purplish-blue oval-shaped balls of light shot out and dispersed all the incoming flames. Without the support of the mysterious power, the scarlet flames quickly withered in the air, giving off a feeling that the turbid air in the air had been cleared. This was not the end. If these inferior imps shot a rain of fire arrows, then Duke's counterattack would fill up the entire field of vision in the true sense of the word bullet screen. These short imps were clearly not adept at close-range combat. Digga and his comrades were confident that if they could get close to them, they could definitely teach them a lesson with their swords. However, there was no telling how many people would fall on the way to them. Digga had a rough estimate in his mind. To control these monsters that kept pouring into the room, they would need at least 30 people to barely do it. However, under the barrage of bullets from Duque's terrifying arcane missiles, these imps were like chickens and dogs that were directly pushed back. Their necks were shot and they suffocated to death, their chests were shot and they died, their skulls were pierced and they were blasted to death by the missiles inside their skulls. Hordes of imps were sent flying in all directions like grass being mowed. Duque, who clearly had the upper hand, suddenly yelled, "Everyone, suppress the imps that come out of the portal." It was rare for Duque to buy time for everyone to charge. The warriors waved their swords and approached the scarlet portal, standing by the side of the door and giving every imp that dared to jump into the room a sharp and accurate blow. Duque's cheeks twitched. For some reason, this reminded him of whack-a-mole. There was another important reason why Duque's arcane missiles could not be sustained. Garona had been hit. Demonic chain. In this room full of runes and arrays, it was clear that Xiahoof could manipulate space to a certain extent. Just as Garona was having the time of her life, she suddenly realized that she had been teleported. The scene in front of him changed instantly and he was in the middle of the room. Thick demonic chains emanating strange evil energy shot out from the blood-red magic circle on the ground and bound Garona tightly. Woo, en, humph. The muscles on Garona's arms and thighs swelled due to the exertion of strength, and the extremely healthy and beautiful lines of her muscles were clearly visible. However, even though her neck was as thick as 2 detonators, she still could not move the demon chains on her body. The beastmen never lacked power, but unfortunately, the mysterious power was not something that could be shaken by brute force. Lothar seemed to want to save Garona, but Duque stopped him. "I'll do it, you go after Xietue." Lothar didn't know why Duque made such an arrangement, but he still followed it. The gorgeous sword that emitted a faint golden glow drew a bright arc in the air and slashed at Xiehoof. As a kind of demon that liked to abuse others, Sartre not only had good spellcasting abilities, but their melee combat abilities were also not to be underestimated. Seeing the aggressive Lothar, Xiehoof actually took out a huge scimitar out of nowhere and started fighting with Lothar. Holding the scimitar in his right hand and waving his claws in his left, he attacked quickly and flexibly, pushing Lothar back. Duque did not care about Lothar. If Lothar was killed like this, then he did not deserve to be called the Lion of Azeroth by the future generations. He shifted his firepower and suddenly blasted it at Garona's chains. It was not an easy task. In the real world, there was no such simple and convenient spell that forbade hurting one's allies. A hit was a hit. Even if Garona had a physique that surpassed humans, she was still an orc at the hero level. Duque was very doubtful that his arcane missiles could hit Garona when she was free to move. But when her body was bound, Garona was a live target. Seeing the overwhelming arcane missiles pouring down, Garona's face showed a frightened expression for the first time. Most orcs were simple-minded and ignorant. When faced with the unknown, it was easy for them to feel awe. Before the orc warlocks were born, they transferred their awe of the unknown and mystery to the shamans. Therefore, orc shamans often had a very high status. Similarly, although she was a mixed blood, Garona still inherited the awe of mystery. Seeing so many arcane missiles, Garona almost suspected that Duque was going to kill her. However, that was not the case. Duque was very clear about Garona's position in the long river of Azeroth's fate. Perhaps there would be such a day when Duque would really attack Garona, but definitely not now. Like a rainstorm, the arcane missiles accurately hit the scarlet demonic chains. Originally, Duque was still worried that his spells could not transcend levels and destroy the demonic chains made by the boss Evil Hoof. He did not know if Lothar's mysterious sword restrained Evil Hoof, or if Evil Hoof's spell itself had a flaw or some strange setting. Duque's attack worked. Under the bombardment of arcane missiles that were as dense as a storm, the thick bloody chains let out a series of tinkling noises before they shattered inch by inch in Garona's and Lothar's peripheral vision. Regaining her freedom, Garona let out an angry roar, and at the same time she did not forget to cast a grateful look at Duque and pounced on him again. As if surprised by the ferocity of Duque's firepower, Tristan Evil Hoof was caught off guard. As if they had practiced countless times, Lothar and Garona's cooperation was extremely tacit. Lothar attacked fiercely from the front, and his swordsmanship was wide open. In the face of every counterattack from Evil Hoof, Lothar's shield could just perfectly deflect most of Evil Hoof's power with a side attack, making Evil Hoof's fierce attacks useless. And taking advantage of Evil Hoof's flaws, he gave a fierce stab. Garona, on the other hand, focused on going around Evil Hoof's back to stab him. The attack of the half-orc female assassin made Evil Hoof's scalp tingle. His solid demonic skin and thick hair could not resist Garona's fierce consecutive slashes at all. In a moment, Evil Hoof's back was already a blur. Evil Hoof tried to retreat to avoid being attacked from the front and back, but Garona's swift kick almost made him stumble and fall to the ground. At this time, a little imp that was obviously bigger than the other little imps jumped out. Duque narrowed his eyes and focused on this big imp. Kirk, Evil Hoof's closest combat partner. As a capable helper of Evil Hoof, Kilrick was definitely not someone to be trifled with. Unfortunately, he had encountered Duke. He had just been summoned, and before he could figure out what was going on, he was sent flying by a huge and illusory palm. Chapter 107. Low-level magic couldn't hurt high-level mysterious beings. It was just like how a person would be fine if they were drenched in water, but it would be terrible if they were hit by a stone. Duque was very clear about his limits. He didn't know if Khadgar, who was a mage apprentice, had encountered Tristan Ilhoof in the game's history. He only knew that if he didn't use some skills, he would be completely useless in a battle of this level, just like the priest just now. After the battle with the Orc Warlock, Duque had already figured out one thing. For the sparse arcane energy of low-level mages, powerful mages who used magic often had very good resistance. They didn't even need to do anything, and the highly concentrated magic in their bodies would automatically disperse the magic attacks of low-level mages. Physical damage was different. Unless it was a boss with a huge body such as a giant dragon or a large demon, very few were not afraid of physical damage. Kilrick was definitely a big guy to other inferior demons, but in front of humans, it was only the size of a 2-year-old baby, just above Lothar's knees. As a support-type demon, Kilrick's strength was in magic attacks, not defense. In the end it was hit. Arcane Impact, a classic arcane spell. Every time Arcane Impact was cast, the damage caused by all arcane spells would increase by 15 to 978%, and the mana consumption of Arcane Impact would also increase by 200%. This effect could be stacked up to a maximum of many times, or it would disappear after casting any damage spell other than Arcane Impact. When Duque first came into contact with this spell after his transmigration, he didn't feel anything. Because once this spell was stacked up, it would consume a lot of mana, which was extremely disadvantageous for a protracted battle. But when Duque was stuck at the threshold of a sky mage, he looked at this spell again and it was like he had found a treasure. As a special mage with Arcane Fire Circuit, Duque didn't have to worry about the lack of mana among those of the same level, but he was extremely lacking in high attack power. The vast amount of mana gave Duque the capital to play around. In the eyes of others, stacking Arcane Impact 3 times was already unbearable, and any more would be the rhythm of draining one's mana pool. So in most spellbooks there was such a note, maximum of 4 stacks. This logic did not apply to Duque. Duque's spellcasting was almost separate. He would allocate enough mana and let the system elf control the magic missile, while Duque himself had been secretly stacking Arcane Impact. When Kilrick appeared, what awaited him was a 7-layered Arcane Impact. Just the power of this spell was enough to drain a genuine level 9 Earth Mage dry. Drizzle. After being compressed and compressed again, the Arcana technique's density had already surpassed that of an incorporeal body, appearing in front of everyone's eyes. If someone were to stab it with a sword, the sword would most likely be broken. Duque was able to take advantage of this powerful Arcana technique attack. It was too much of a waste to just use an arcane technique. Therefore what Xianxia, Lothar and Garona saw was that after the little demon was hit by a dazzling purplish-blue Arcana technique attack, the terrifying Arcana technique did not dissipate. Instead, the dissipating energy condensed again under the control of Duque's mental strength. A huge Arcana technique palm that was as tall as a human appeared. Like a huge palm, it slammed onto Kilrick's head with the force of a mountain. Bam! It was a tremor that shook the entire huge room. The helper that Xianxia had painstakingly recruited was instantly killed by Duque's 2 consecutive attacks. Looking at Kilrick, who had turned from a little demon to a demon paste and then disintegrated into illusory evil energy and dissipated, Lothar actually had the leisure to stick out his tongue. At first, Lothar and Garona did not know why Duque would use such a powerful attack on an inconspicuous little demon. After a blink of an eye they understood. This huge satyr that was not to be trifled with was showing a state of weakness that they had never seen before. His speed, strength, mental strength and reflexes had all dropped significantly. Lothar could even feel from the feeling of the long sword stabbing into Xianxia's body that the defense of Xianxia's skin and muscles had plummeted. Good job, Duque. Lothar whistled happily. After easily blocking Xianxia's machete with his shield, Lothar suddenly slashed his sword across Xianxia's neck. The sword that carried some kind of divine power cut through a quarter of Xianxia's neck like a piece of white paper. The cut was so big that even the naked eye could see it clearly. Purple blood spurted out in large mouthfuls like ketchup being sold cheaply. If Xianxia was a human, this attack would have been enough to kill him. The body of a demon could never be measured by human standards. Perhaps realizing the power of the sword in Lothar's hand, Xianxia actually endured more attacks on other parts of his body and covered his wound with his left claw to reduce blood loss. Seeing that victory was in sight, Lothar and Garona both stepped up their attacks. At this moment even Duque joined the siege of Xianxia. Lothar and Garona were very unfamiliar with the cooperation with mages. They could tell each other's position with the naked eye, so they simply separated and attacked Xie without affecting each other. Mages. Even Lothar had never worked with mages, not to mention Garona, who was rarely seen by mages. Didn't they say that there was a Mediv? Come on, when the Mediv really took action, Lothar wouldn't have anything to do. The other pharaoh were mostly arrogant and you could only see the nostrils of the pharaoh, let alone talk about cooperation. For a moment Lothar shuddered. He didn't know how to cooperate with Duque. It must be noted that this was also the first time that he and Garona had truly worked together. He was the distraction and Garona was the main attacker. Plus Duque? Magic didn't have eyes. A few seconds later Lothar, however, was relieved. Duque was so impressive that he didn't look like a newbie who had been exposed to magic for less than a year. Not to mention earth mages, it was likely that most sky mages wouldn't be able to use magic at the same level as Duque. Lothar was the distraction from the front, and Garona was the backstab, but Duque couldn't keep up with Garona's wild movements. It could be said that there was almost no gap on the entire ground for Duque to attack. In Lothar's opinion, the only way to find him was to pass by him in a heartbeat. Unexpectedly, Duque played a bomb. Chapter 108. A huge purplish-blue energy ball floated less than 2 meters above Evil Hoof's head. Duque didn't attack casually. Once Evil Hoof attacked Lothar, a powerful arcane impact would hit Evil Hoof's head the moment Lothar raised his shield. Usually, Duque would ask the lesser demons to stack the arcane impact appropriately. Basically, the number of arcane impact layers was maintained at around 5 to 7. When Evil Hoof summoned Kill Rick again and was killed by Duque's arcane energy hand, Evil Hoof finally realized that it was his end. No. After Garona's gorgeous dagger combo finally hurt Xiaofui's eyeballs, Noxus found an opportunity. The blade glowing with a mysterious golden light accurately pierced into Xiaofui's heart and twisted. Back off. Lothar and Garona heard Dukes shout at the same time. Both of them jumped back, causing Evil Hoof's claw, which had suddenly grown bigger, to miss. Only then did Noxus realize that a dozen or so hands of magic had appeared in the air, and each of them was condensed with a fireball the size of a human head. Almost at the same time Lothar and Garona jumped back. Dense crimson fireballs rained down like a meteor shower, bombarding Evil Hoof's body. Evil Hoof, whose vitality had been greatly reduced, could no longer condense more mana to resist Duque's fireballs. This caused the flames of the fireballs to converge like a pillar of fire. A small but very intricate fire tornado appeared in the middle of the room. Not only was it burning and tearing Evil Hoof's body, but it was also so hot that the marble floor seemed to be melting. Oh! Evil Hoof let out a final scream in the flames. Evil Hoof was dead. His entire body was burned from the inside out by the flames from hell. The stinky demonic energy spread everywhere. Most of it was burned by Duque's flames, but a little bit leaked out. The room was filled with a faint stench. With Evil Hoof's death, the teleportation gate that sent the lesser demons here also lost its support and disappeared. The lively room fell into silence for a moment, leaving only the heavy breathing of the crowd. This level of battle was nothing to Noxus. He tilted his head and looked around, only to find that none of his subordinates had fallen to the ground. It was definitely a good thing that no one had died. Being mentally prepared to sacrifice oneself and actually having someone sacrifice themselves were two different things. Without saying anything, Lothar gave Duque and Garona a thumbs up. The difference in their combat strength had been completely reflected in the battle just now. Lothar and Garona were clearly in the first tier. Other than the two of them, the only one who could help was probably Duque. The rest of the people, including the priest, were to deal with the small fries. Duque covered his nose and said in a low voice, "Everyone go out for a while. I need to collect the spoils of war." Spoils of war? Noxus was slightly taken aback. Indeed, it was only right and proper for the victors to obtain the spoils of war. However, most of the things that could be obtained on the battlefield were swords and personal items, or the enemy's flag as one's own glory. There wouldn't be too many actual good things. Now that they had killed a mid-level satyr, Duque was actually saying that it was a spoil of war? Lothar was really a little curious. There had never been any demons near Stormwind City. If killing evil creatures like demons could not only bring glory but also benefits, it might be a highlight. For some reason, Lothar had a deep feeling that there would probably be more and more demons. The more he knew about demons, the easier it would be to deal with them in the future. On the other side, Duque began to give orders to the system elf. Scan the spoils of war for anything with strong magic energy. Yes, host. After a short few seconds, the system elf gave guidance. 10 steps to the west, the bookshelf with 3 magic books with red covers, the 3rd floor, the 5th book from the left, open. Seeing Duque's actions, Garona tilted her head curiously while Lothar was simply dumbfounded. He had never seen Duque with such sparkling eyes. This guy was clearly rich, and if he claimed to be the second richest person in Stormwind City, no one would dare to claim to be the first. However, it was precisely this existence that had an undisguised ecstasy on his face at this moment. He was like a miser who had found a gold mine. On one side he was almost crazy, and at the same time he was absolutely unwilling to share it with others. I'm not a black hand. I'm not a black hand. Muttering words that Lothar and Garona would never understand, Duque drifted to the left like a ghost. Black hand? Garona tilted her head, puzzled. Why did he say the name of the orc chief? But she did not know that this black hand was not the black hand that he was referring to. Duque really wanted to find something to wash his hands with, like a bath or incense. Although Duque didn't believe in metaphysics, as a former commander of World of Warcraft who had cleared the Molten Core instance dungeon in 1 week and made a warlock and a druid graduate with full equipment, Duque didn't believe that his hands were that lucky. Lothar, can you do me a favor? Having killed a powerful demon, Lothar was in a good mood. With a bright smile he said, with pleasure. Duque pointed at the huge magic book and said, there's something in here. If I touch it, I'm afraid that I'll turn black. I'm afraid that I'll be stained with evil presence. It'll be great if you can use your sword to open this magic book. It was definitely a strange request. If it were someone else, Lothar would definitely suspect that this guy was tricking him. But Lothar could clearly sense Duque's dilemma. With a smile, he gently pierced the bottom of the big book with his gorgeous long sword and flicked it up. The whole big book flew out just like that. The big book, which weighed at least 5 kilograms, fell to the ground with a loud crash. To his surprise, the unrestrained pages didn't open. The pages were all stuck together as if they were glued. Noxus frowned slightly. He subconsciously protected half of his body with a shield, and then the sharp blade pierced through the pages. Hiss! With a sound, Duque's heart lurched. Damn it, there really is an evil presence. However, the demonic power left by the evil hooves was a big problem for Duque. It was a piece of cake for Lothar. Under the dispelling of the godly power of the sword that Duque secretly called the king's sword, the small demonic power was instantly swept away. The book opened, revealing a hollowed-out inside. Inside was a cloth belt and a strange ornament. Duque couldn't help but feel delighted. Chapter 109. The Azeroth of this moment was far from the situation of magic equipment in the future. When he had money after transmigrating, Duque had always been thinking about getting a set of magic equipment, but having money was useless. He didn't know if the real world of Azeroth had inherited the principle of binding to pick up in the game. Duque couldn't find any good equipment even after asking people all over the world. As a result, Duque didn't even have a decent piece of equipment. No staff, no equipment, just a set of beginner's robes from the Wong family's mage guild. This was the real world, so there shouldn't be things like soul binding or level limits in the game. Just in case, Duque didn't dare to have too much hope and touched the 2 items. The system notification popped up almost at the same time. Fiend's Waste. This is a mage belt of unknown origin, surging with strange mysterious energy. Obviously it will slightly increase the power of your arcane circuit. However, this is a piece of equipment that can only be used by high-grade sky mages, so you can probably get a 20% increase now. Accessory. Capacitor. This is a magic item that connects to an elemental world full of lightning. It will collect your arcane energy pulse, and only the most explosive pulse can activate it and make it work. After you have accumulated 3 powerful pulses, it will automatically open the door to the elemental world for you, releasing a bolt of lightning to attack your current target. Hiss. Duque still took a deep breath. It wasn't a shock but a pleasant surprise. First, it was a piece of equipment that was definitely a mid to high level item in the game, but he could actually use it at such a low level. This made Duque completely change his mind about Karazhan. Originally, Duque didn't expect to use Karazhan's equipment. After all, he was too low level. And these bosses in Karazhan in the original history only appeared in the middle of the game. The second was the appearance of Capacitor. As a transmigrator, Duque immediately realized the value of this thing. The explosive pulse could be understood as critical damage. Generally speaking, it wasn't easy to stack critical hits. Duque was definitely a special case because he had the ability to cast multiple spells that most mages did not have. More than 100 hands of magic launched attacks at the same time. Even the simplest arcane missile often had a critical hit on the damage assessment given by the system elves. It could be said that the Capacitor was a top-quality item for Duke. If Lothar was Aurelia, Duque would definitely hug him to see if they could have a little flirting. Unfortunately, bearded Uncle Lothar, forget it. Duque didn't hide his ecstasy and Lothar also smiled. Good stuff. It didn't look like a demon, so it should be the relic of an unknown mage. I'm sure that mage would be very happy to be able to make good use of these things. Duque didn't act pretentious and immediately used what he needed. There was a small pin on the capacitor, and Duque first pinned it to the fiend girdle before putting on the belt. Almost as soon as the belt was fastened, Duque felt the magic circuit in his body change. It was a very mysterious feeling. The original arcane fire circuit had already become a large, circular river. Now it felt like a new tributary had flowed into it. If magic power was described as water, then Duque's water volume had increased by at least 20%. This was a terrifying number. Duque couldn't help but exclaim in his heart, this equipment from Karazhan, even if it's not complete, is still a huge improvement for me. At this time, Garona also came up. Did you sense anything I can use? Duque looked a little embarrassed. Sorry, no. Evil Hoof is not an agile monster. I don't think there are many things suitable for you. I see. Garona shrugged. It wasn't a big deal. Half-beastmen were so simple and direct. She had contributed to the battle, and if there was something suitable she definitely wanted a share. But if there was nothing suitable she didn't mind. Garona wiped the blood on the dagger with Evil Hoof's unstained fur. Okay, how do we go now? Duque touched his chin and pondered. It was a good thing to encounter Evil Hoof as soon as he came in, because it proved that his raid team had bypassed a lot of bosses at the front gate of Karazhan. But as for what to do next, he would have to think carefully. However, Duque looked at Lothar. Lothar shrugged. Don't look at me, I did come here with Lang many times before, but we always walked in from the main entrance. We usually chatted near the opera house and watched the performances. We had never entered such a deep place before. Besides, I haven't been to the first half of Karazhan for almost 10 years. The last few times I came I sat on the griffin and landed on the high platform. Then Medivh opened a small portal for me and I stepped into his study. Duque suddenly understood. He suddenly understood why there was an opera house when he played Karazhan in the game before. That was the opera house that Lang often visited Medivh with Lothar and a group of nobles when he was young. Medivh specially designed the opera house in the Mage Tower to welcome Lang. Of course, if this was the standard version of Karazhan, Duque would not get lost even with his eyes closed. But Karazhan with space disorder was a bit troublesome. Duque decided. Let's go out first. Generally speaking, going higher is the right thing to do. Okay. Lothar had no objections and his men and Garona had no objections either. Just then, a powerful and evil will suddenly connected to the huge room. If it weren't for the huge blood-red fog that enveloped the room itself, Lothar and the others even suspected that the terrifying will would directly descend into the room. Tristan, what the hell are you doing? Why is my eyes telling me that there's a battle here? Even though the tone of the voice were completely different, Lothar immediately recognized that it was Medivh's voice. Of course, it was Sargeras who spoke. Oh no, we're going to be exposed. Even though they were very unwilling, Lothar and his men still put on a fighting stance and prepared for battle. But, before seeing Medivh, was there any use in preparing for battle? Just when everyone was sweating, Duque spoke. He pinched his throat and the voice that came out of his mouth was Tristan's. Sorry, master, it's Gilric teaching a few disobedient bastards a lesson. Chapter 110. It was exactly the same voice, and even the aristocratic manner of speaking and accent had been imitated. Lothar and Garona, who were beside Duque, looked like they had seen a ghost. If it weren't for the fact that the sword in their hands didn't show any signs of Duque being possessed by a demon, Lothar would have slashed him. Although they couldn't see Sargeras' expression, Sargeras clearly wasn't interested in the trivial matter of a middle-ranked demon teaching a low-ranked demon a lesson. Demons themselves were also divided into different ranks. Low-ranked demons such as imps and inferior demons were even worse than cannon fodder in front of their boss, Sargeras. Humph. Sargeras, who was busy every day, snorted coldly and then his will retreated. Lothar, Garona and Duque looked at each other. Duque suddenly sighed to Lothar. Fortunately you weren't impulsive. Lothar curled his lips. I should be the one saying that to you. I've lived for more than 40 years and I'm long past the age of impulsiveness. If impulsiveness and sacrifice can solve the problem, of course I don't mind. But I'm not only the kingdom's military commander, but I also shoulder the hopes of Lang and the entire kingdom's people. Before I see Medivh, I won't expose myself. Garona was curious about Duque's voice change. How did you change your voice? Duque rolled his eyes and argued. If you know, then you're a mage. What should he say? That the system elf helped him complete the temporary voice change? That was nonsense. Since there was no way to explain it, he might as well push it to the realm of mystery. The assault team returned to their marching formation. Garona explored the way in front, while Lothar protected Duque as he moved forward. After entering the back door of Karazhan, the space was chaotic. Many times there was no path at all, only a teleportation portal that emitted an illusory light. One could only judge whether to go in or not by the faint aura coming from the other side of the portal. Moreover, most portals were one way. However, Duque relied on the system elf and didn't go the wrong way. Even Lothar was surprised, because he also found that his team should be moving higher and higher in Karazhan. Duque, how did you do it? You discovered the pattern of the portal? No, I judged it based on the humidity of the air, the dust, and the density of magic power. The density of the magic power. Noxus pondered. In fact, Duque was also talking nonsense. Being rich in mana was the most unreliable factor in Karazhan. Because this place was connected to the astral world, there were all kinds of astral world creatures. This kind of spatial rift that crossed worlds was completely unpredictable. He still relied on the Karazhan in his memory, and then let the system elf simulate and compare the nearby environment. Although there were still times when he was wrong, most of the time his choice was correct. However, Duque's appearance had turned many terrifying risks into controllable ones. Astral flare. A high-energy spherical object that shines with light. If it weren't for Duque, the team would have suffered a shocking number of casualties. Because this thing would self-destruct. As a veteran player, Duque immediately associated this thing with the annoying monster in his memory. He turned an arcane impact into a palm and hit the incoming astral flare away. Seeing the astral flare explode violently, Noxus was tongue-tied. Are you sure this thing won't alarm Medivh? Duque tilted his head. No, there's a huge astral rift here. Flare explosions happen every day. Here, even if you bring a few hundred people to a party, Medivh won't care. Another example was the ethereal thief. This monster was very unfriendly to melee professions. Although it had a human form wrapped in bandages, it was an unmistakable astral world creature in its bones. They could create a distorted space, temporarily taking away a person's strength and reducing their agility. After only staying in the spatial distortion for a dozen seconds, Noxus's face was already pale. When Duque used an instant pyroblast to teach the ethereal thief a lesson, Noxus's weak legs instantly regained their strength. After who knew how long, Duque and the others arrived outside a huge library. Duque frowned. He knew which boss was inside. You stay outside. I'll talk to that person inside. If it doesn't work, I'll call you in. But it'd be best if Noxus and Garona come in. After all, other people will only be a burden. You know who's inside? Noxus raised an eyebrow. I do. He's left a deep mark in the kingdom's history. Duque went in alone. He stayed inside for a full 10 minutes, but there was no sound of movement. 10 minutes later, Duque came out calmly. Scope. We avoided a battle. Noxus asked tentatively, is there anything we need to know? Yes, we might have reinforcements. You convinced the guy inside. Sort of. Along the way, Duque and the others arrived at a huge hall. There were many arcades and tall marble pillars on both sides of the hall. In the middle of the hall, on a high platform made of black and white tiles, there was a sudden flash of light. After the light disappeared, a group of figures appeared. Noxus couldn't stay calm at all. He saw his best friend and king, Lang. That Lang was so realistic that Noxus almost shouted out loud. Not only Noxus but the elite soldiers behind Noxus also made a low commotion. However, whether it was Lang or the people around him, none of them moved. The same was true for the ferocious orcs opposite him. Of course this was the Karazhan chess stage. Since there was already Evil Hoof and that person in front of them, Duque was not surprised at all by the appearance of Karazhan chess. It seems that we're going to play a game of chess. Duque shrugged. He walked in front of a strange human-shaped statue. Suddenly, a voice came from the statue directly into the minds of Duque, Noxus, Garona and all the soldiers. You and your friend, are you ready to become a chess piece on the battlefield and join this battle? Duque was slightly stunned. This seemed to be different from the Karazhan chess he knew. On the other side, Noxus had already raised his head and replied, "We're ready." The next moment, a white light emerged from everyone's body. In a completely conscious state, they suddenly found that their souls had been extracted and attached to the chess pieces on the black and white chessboard. The voice of the statue came again. "Fight, fight, the souls of the losers will be destroyed. And the winner will receive a reward." As the voice fell, everyone's expression suddenly changed. Not only because this was a battle of souls, but also because there were so many more chess pieces on the other side. Other than Lang's king's sword in his hand, this was exactly what King Lang would wear on the battlefield. This kind of rebellious attire made Lothar feel extremely uncomfortable. If Noxus was the only one who experienced such a change, he would probably die of shame. For some reason, Noxus felt much better with someone accompanying him. He was wearing a scarf made of a soft white feather collar. The scarf was connected to a long cloak that reached the ground. Dressed in a clean and dry mage robe, Duke, who had an ordinary appearance, now looked like a scholar. The most eye-catching thing was that Duque was holding something that belonged to Medivh in his right hand. The artifact that symbolized the glory of the Guardians, the Staffatish Guardian. Well, it seemed that Andoin had taken the role of Lang and Duque had become Medivh. Duque glanced at his own attire and sighed softly. "Sigh, Sir Lothar, don't mind this appearance. This is an illusion brought about by magic. It doesn't mean anything. The people here are all good soldiers loyal to you, to Stormwind and to the world of Azeroth. No one will blame you for this. Let's focus on the next battle." At this time, an existence that made Garona's entire body and soul tremble appeared. It was an orc that didn't look tall compared to the other orcs. He was hunched and wore a loose black robe. There were a few bone spikes on his back that pointed to the sky. There were a few dreamy eye skulls stuck on the bone spikes. He had terrible fangs with many rotten teeth, and a pair of eyes that emitted an evil green light. "Gul'dan." Garona said the name that was almost taboo to her with a trembling voice. "Gul'dan is here too?" Lothar raised his eyebrows and looked at the orc warlock who was dozens of steps away. Lothar had heard from Garona about the most noteworthy people among the orcs. Of course he wouldn't forget Gul'dan, who was known as the most dangerous person. However, what was going on in front of him? It wasn't that the other party didn't want to fight, but that they seemed to be blocked by something. Wait a minute, this seems to be a death game with souls on the line. Of course the other party isn't the real Blackhand Chief and the real Gul'dan. However, it's different from ordinary games. It seems that we can get reinforcements. Reinforcements? Lothar was stunned. Where do we get reinforcements from? Lothar wasn't the only one who was stunned. Duque was also stunned. The system actually prompted him. This is a death game with souls on the line. If you add more souls, you can have more reinforcements. This will undoubtedly increase your chances of winning. The current strength ratio is 11 to 89. Damn. This is clearly going against the wind. Isn't this forcing me to top up? Is this another stupid game where I don't have money to play? Are you kidding me? The next moment, Duque decisively slapped his own mouth. This was because he saw on the list that the system elf projected on his retina that he could use to top up. The muscles on Duque's face showed what it meant to be temperamental in just a few seconds. Actually there are reinforcements. It's just that they look a bit bad for the city. Don't mind them. As long as it's for victory for Azeroth. Lothar was extremely magnanimous. Anyway, without you we probably wouldn't have made it here. If you have any tricks, just use them. Just as Duque was about to summon those guys, a bright red and dazzling warning text on his retina made Duque's head hurt. Warning. Warning. The chess pieces that you've summoned are the monsters that you killed back then. They are powerful and inhumane. If you let them enter the battlefield, there's a 99% chance that they will rebel and join the enemy's camp. Damn, isn't this just throwing a rock at my penis? What's the solution? Duque almost cursed at the system elf. You just need to inject your integrity, humanity into them, and they will completely listen to your instructions in this battle. For a moment, Duque almost didn't want to top up. But he immediately felt gazes from all directions. Lothar's gaze, Garona's gaze, the elite soldier's gaze, and even the gazes of millions of humans. Duque gritted his teeth. For faith, top up. Chapter 112. If it was before, Duque would have thought that he was crazy. Now he felt a bit like a gambler. He could have pulled out early, but he hoped to win everything back through a big comeback. He had put on even more moral integrity in order to win and gain more recognition after defeating Medivh. At the same time, he had also taken back his own moral integrity. Thinking deeper, it was not the case at all. The seemingly crazy move actually stemmed from a heavier sense of responsibility. Khadgar hung up. The heavy burden of fate that originally belonged to Khadgar fell on Duque's shoulders. The fate of the kingdom, the fate of mankind, and even the fate of the entire planet Azeroth were controlled by Duque's choice. Of course, Duque could not put on his integrity and let Lothar's elite soldiers fight to the death in their current state. Although they had long disregarded life and death, who could guarantee that they would be able to win by sacrificing them? Who could guarantee that there would be no sacrifice in the next round of chess? Could Duque live up to their burning and trusting eyes? Duque did not know that he was standing at a crossroads with countless crossroads. Countless people stopped at this crossroads that required great courage. Because of human instinct, people often chose to protect themselves. Perhaps they chose to escape because of cowardice. Perhaps they chose to sacrifice others because of indifference. Or perhaps they were arrogant and supercilious. But unknowingly, Duque chose to follow his heart. He wanted to change this history and change the direction of the River of Fate. So he took a step that even he did not dare to imagine before. Lothar had always had amazing intuition. As a half-orc, Garona's senses were also quite sharp. Both of them almost immediately noticed the change in Duque. Before this, there had been a tragic atmosphere spreading among the team, and everyone was ready to sacrifice. But with the change in Duque's soul fluctuations, everyone suddenly found that they had many more companions around them. More than 1,000 funny-looking murlocs. They held extremely primitive weapons and roared at the orcs opposite them. More than 200 giant gnolls more than 2 meters tall. Among the hundreds of Nagas, there was a female Naga siren priest. Lothar's elite soldiers were dumbfounded when they were suddenly surrounded by such a large group of monsters. Our reinforcements. Duque laughed heartily. Ha. Long live Sir Marcus. Victory. Victory, morale soared. Noxus, on the other hand, was surprised. Then he looked a little sad. He approached Duque and asked in a low voice, "Did you pay with your soul? What integrity? Just pick it back up after you lose it." That was what Duque wanted to say at first, but the words changed when they reached the tip of his tongue. Everyone is prepared to sacrifice themselves for humanity, and I'm the only one hiding in the safety circle. Is that appropriate? Staring at the orcs opposite him, Duque's vision seemed to go beyond this strange chess space, beyond Karazhan and beyond the whole world. If there comes a day when I fall into madness because of the loss of my soul, please destroy me with your own hands. For some reason, Duke's smile seemed so light, yet it was as heavy as a mountain. Lothar suddenly found himself choking. He patted Duque's shoulder with one hand. Okay, if there comes a day I will do it myself. But if I am lucky enough to return to Stormwind, I will spend the rest of my life sculpting a huge statue for you that the whole country can see in the King's Valley. This was a man's promise, this was a hero's promise. Duque suddenly found that he had completely gained the approval of this epic hero Anduin Lothar. With a faint smile on his face, Duque turned his head. Let's take care of these guys first. The combat power of the two sides had changed because of Duque's soul charge. Duque used 5% of his moral integrity as the price in exchange for an increase in combat power. From the initial overwhelming disadvantage, the two sides' combat power was 45 to 55. And this was just a simple increase in numbers. Duque could not expect these guys he killed to perform well. Noel Hogg and his little brother, the gray-scaled Naga Siren Priest, a group of male Nagas and more than 1,000 unreliable Murlocs. Such a combination of land and sea was extremely unreliable. Not only Duque saw it but Lothar also saw it. Duque, are these guys under your control? Yes. I plan to let the Murlocs attack from the right side first and then the Gnolls from the left. Lothar was a man who knew his soldiers well. He immediately understood Duque's plan. Drag the left and right, then break through in the middle and give the opponent a fatal blow. Good idea. Yes, this damn game of death ends with the death of the opponent's general. On the black and white tiles, the Murlocs took their seemingly ridiculous steps and charged under the whips of the Nagas. The whole battlefield was filled with Murlocs, and even they themselves might not understand the meaning of their cries. They formed a black mass and swept towards the orcs like a huge wave. On the surface, they seemed to have the momentum to drown the orc army in one breath. However, that was just what it looked like. The orcs standing at the front formed a green wall. The Murlocs at the front handed out their rough spears to the orc army. If there was no accident, they would pierce the chest of the orc in front in 3 seconds. Unfortunately, there was no lack of accidents in the world. They crashed into a wall of death made of heavy weapons. It was as if they had really crashed into an invisible wall. The giant hammers and axes that came smashing down on their heads easily smashed their crude weapons and their laughable fish-shaped heads into smithereens. This terrible destructive power made the impact of the entire Murloc stagnate. The Murlocs at the front who saw this scene tried to retreat, and the Murlocs at the back who did not know the reason continued to rush forward, squeezing the space of their companions. Haha. Bastard Murlocs. Die. Die. The berserk great chieftain's forbidden guards opened their mouths, which were filled with bloody veins and fangs. They let out earth-shattering roars as they attacked while chopping melons and vegetables. Often each swing could smash multiple Murlocs into meat paste or split them into several pieces. The Murlocs were obviously stunned by the wild attack of the other party. Chaos spread rapidly, hundreds of Murlocs collided in the center of the battlefield, and for a moment it was a pot of porridge. If it was not for the scolding of the Nagas behind, maybe the Murlocs would have collapsed. Chapter 113. Lothar and his soldiers frowned at this pig-like teammate. It was worse than a farmer with a pitchfork who had no combat experience at all. If they didn't know that this was Duque's cannon fodder, they would probably be cursing. 2 minutes later, the situation changed again. The orcs' formation was in chaos. After the orcs drank the demon's blood, every green-skinned orc had extremely wild genes in their bodies. Even though this was a simulation brought by the chess checkpoint, it reflected this fact. After a short confrontation, the guards of the great chief brandished their heavy weapons and charged into the Murlocs. However, when they were ready to kill, they encountered the gray-scaled Nagas. The male gray-scaled Nagas were not high-level soldiers, but they relied on their strong muscles and better weapons that were not inferior to the orcs. Although they were still at a disadvantage, they succeeded in attracting the attention of the orcs. At this time, under Duque's mind control, Hogg, who had died tragically in Duque's hands, led his underlings to attack from the left. Duque suddenly felt an inexplicable sense of joy. Because of the addition of the demon's power, Hogg and his underlings, who had almost taught Duque how to be a human, all grew bigger and became so burly. Now, when the system prompted that Hogg's soul could be inserted, Duque was a little worried. He didn't know if this was a trash version of the Gnoll without the demon's power. One had to know that the original Gnoll was less than a meter tall. This kind of body size was really worse than whack-a-mole against the orcs. Fortunately, Duque had an enhanced version of Hogg, and the soul he had invested was also an enhanced version. These Gnolls, who were more burly than the Murlocs, relied on their superior agility to successfully entangle more than 100 of the Great Chief's guards. Even though Black Hen's direct subordinates were stronger, they couldn't gain the upper hand for a while. Lothar and Duque looked at each other. As the saying goes, great minds think alike. They knew that the opportunity had come. For glory. Charge. Lothar waved the king's sword and charged. Male lions rarely participated in hunting. Most of the time, the task of hunting for the lions fell to the lionesses. Very few people knew that when a lion that was lazy all day attacked, its aura was so terrifying. Lothar's charge wasn't fast. He was like an arrow that had just left the bow. However, Lothar's charge gave off an unstoppable feeling that the mountains were collapsing and the earth was cracking. The heavy and firm footsteps were sonorous and forceful. His naturally wavy hair was like a lion's mane in the strong wind, giving people an explosive sense of beauty. It was getting closer and closer. Noxus could clearly see every single strand of hair on the face of the Orc Imperial Guard. He was panting heavily and every single tooth on his mouth was so unconventional. He even vaguely felt that he could smell the foul breath of the orcs' mouths. Ha! Lothar leaped forward like a lion pouncing on its prey. He raised his shield and charged into the middle of the Orc Royal Guards. At that moment, in the eyes of the elite soldiers who were charging with Lothar, their beloved Sir Lothar seemed to be the incarnation of the god of war and the symbol of invincibility. Following Lothar's back and looking at the cloak embroidered with the emblem of Stormwind on Lothar's back, they felt like they were fighting with the god of victory. A surge of hot blood surged into their hearts, causing every corner of the warriors' bodies to boil. In the blink of an eye, Lothar had already killed 3 Orc Royal Guards. Their extremely swift counterattack in the eyes of outsiders was as laughable as clowns in slow motion in Lothar's eyes. Thrusting the sword, drawing the sword, and the fatal attack were completed in the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint. The weaker warriors couldn't even see how Lothar cut the orc's throat with the blade of his long sword. If Lothar's attack was still traceable, Garona's attack was even more strange and swift. No one could see how Garona attacked. The appearance of this female half-orc, who was petite compared to the orcs, was bound to be accompanied by the scene of several orcs covering their vitals and falling to the ground with blood gushing out of their fingers. The combination of Lothar and Garona was the most dazzling flag in the eyes of the warriors of Stormwind. No, there was another dazzling flag. Duque. 36 hands of magic appeared out of thin air, and shining arcane missiles tore through the void and poured down like a storm on the Orc Royal Guards who were trying to surround and annihilate Lothar. Not only the missiles, but there was also an endless stream of lightning. The frequency of the lightning was so high that it almost made people forget whether Duque was using arcane missiles or thunderbolt. Duque's magic skills were so superb that he even used dazzling spells to shoot down Ghoul Dan's rain of fire that was trying to hit Lothar. The collision of arcane spells, lightning and flames formed a magnificent scene in the sky above the battlefield. Duque's extremely accurate cover made Lothar remember that there was only one chance. Once they were surrounded, the humans at a disadvantage would only be drowned in the raging sea of orcs and face destruction in despair. The performance of the 3 made the elites of Stormwind almost forget time and space, and subconsciously locked their eyes on the 3 of them. They only came back to their senses when the first orc warrior who was struck let out a pained wail. They focused all their attention on this battle where their lives and souls were on the line. For some reason, there was a burning passion in the chests of the warriors. They couldn't wait to end this battle with victory, and then tell the heroic deeds of these 3 legends to their comrades, relatives, and everyone who paid attention to the world of Azeroth. Lothar pulled out his long sword, and the last Orc Royal Guard in front of him let out an angry and desperate scream. When the burly body that was like a wall collapsed, there was no longer any barrier between Lothar and the Great Chief's Black Hand. The battlefield instantly fell silent. Another tall and burly orc with reddish-brown skin with explosive muscles appeared. He raised his huge warhammer high and waved it at Garona. King against king. General against general. Traitor Garona, your opponent is me, Orgrim Doomhammer. Beside him, Ghoul Dan leaned on the infamous skull staff and pointed at Duque from afar. Kid, your opponent is me, Ghoul Dan. Duque's pupils suddenly shrank, and the breath in his chest seemed to carry a certain excitement. He didn't know what the situation in this chest space would be like. He only knew that in this group of people only he could fight against Ghoul Dan. Come. Chapter 114. Stormwind City's night sky was as calm as ever. The darkness of the night came as usual, just like how people always believed that the light of dawn would always come every day. In the dark night, crimson flames constantly shone through the fog in the distance, declaring destruction and terror to Stormwind City, an enclave that hung alone outside of the human political center of the entire continent. To the west of Stormwind City, the sea that had not changed since the last descendants of Thoradin the Great arrived 1,000 years ago shone with starlight. With the clear moonlight hanging over the sea, one could vaguely see that Stormwind Port, which had been dark once night fell a year ago, was now brightly lit and filled with sails and masts. Other than the sound of the rolling waves, there were also the voices of people coming from afar. Looking at Stormwind Port, King Lang suddenly sighed to the Queen. "My dear, I've been thinking about a question. Is Duke Marcus our kingdom's destined guardian? If you look at the current situation, it's obvious that he is." "That's right." The Queen gently tightened her grip on Lang's arm. Without his Stormwind Port, Stormwind City might have already started to collapse. Before the orcs came, everyone thought that the new Stormwind Port that Duque built was just a useful supplement to Stormwind City's revenue. As the war progressed, everyone realized that Stormwind Port and Duque's fleet actually controlled the kingdom's fate, becoming its pulse. Stormwind City was located in the south of the continent. With all the roads to the north blocked by the orcs, the sea became Stormwind City's only lifeline to the outside world. In this era, entering the port at night was extremely dangerous. But in order to transport the military supplies that Stormwind City lacked, the old captains of Stormwind City and the maritime kingdom of Cultivation not only transported during the day, but also to save space in the port and increase the transport capacity, they even chose to enter the port at dusk, unload the goods overnight and leave at midnight. With the efforts of a group of captains and sailors, all kinds of supplies were continuously transported from the other human kingdoms and the dwarves' iron furnace castle. Women and children who needed to be evacuated were transported ahead of time, all the way north across the sea to South Shore. Since the 7 human kingdoms had yet to come up with a unified opinion on the orcs' invasion, the aid given to Stormwind City at this stage could basically be regarded as civilian assistance. Most of the nobles in the north scoffed at what Lang's messenger said about the orcs' large-scale invasion and how great the harm would be. "What's the big deal about orcs? We've been killing the trolls here for thousands of years, but we still haven't killed them all." This was the opinion of most of the nobles. They expressed the most malicious suspicions and speculations regarding the fall of half of Storm City. The only fortunate thing was that the Alterac Kingdom agreed to lend South Shore to settle the refugees from Stormwind. As for the other 6 kingdoms, they allowed Lang's proposal to purchase supplies, allowing the people of Stormwind City to purchase all kinds of military supplies and fiercely cracking down on the illegal merchants who inflated prices. At the same time, Lang was allowed to send people to recruit volunteers and mercenaries from the 6 kingdoms. However, this was not enough. Only Lang, who was facing the orc rampage head-on, knew that this would require the 7 kingdoms to declare an all-out war at the same time, gathering the 7 kingdoms as well as the dwarves and the elves as allies, before it would be enough. As soon as he thought of this, Lang felt a wave of suffocation in his heart. So far, everything that Duke had offered, every idea that he had offered had been good. For example, a new type of blockhouse. That was something that Duque left behind. A fellow called Makarov was in charge of. It had a strange name, cement. As for how this thing was made, Makarov was tight-lipped. Even Makarov himself said that it was only a half-finished product. The effect was obvious. The newly designed hexagonal blockhouse was very good at delaying the orcs' offensive. This blockhouse was about 3 stories high, made from this cement, mixed with stones and sand, and in a short 2 to 3 days, it became extremely sturdy. Under the command of an unknown member of the Mason Brotherhood, Edwin Van Cleef, Duque's personally appointed name, in the outskirts of Goldshire, one of the barriers of Stormwind City, no less than 500 of these blockhouses were built in just a few days. Even the largest orc catapults could not easily destroy this kind of blockhouse. The narrow shooting holes made it so that the orcs could not even reach in. A large number of Duque's trained javelin throwers hid in these blockhouses, and from various shooting holes, they gave the orcs a heavy counterattack. When the orcs used the cruelest and most brutal way to destroy the blockhouse, the harpooneers could use the tunnel that they had dug beforehand to drill into the next blockhouse through a tunnel that was so narrow that only humans could pass through and continue to kill the orcs. There were even stories of some outstanding javelin throwers achieving great feats that even the bravest of Stormwind City warriors couldn't do. That guy killed 36 strong orc warriors by himself, and left a mark on the orc's forehead with a javelin mark, which became the best proof of this feat. What made Lang not know whether to laugh or cry was that Stormwind had an additional army, the Murlocs. These abominable monsters that once caused incomparable headaches for the residents of the Elven Forest had now become the guardians of the people of Stormwind. The Murlocs let out inexplicable cackling sounds, and occupied almost every river in the Elven Forest that was more than 5 meters wide. Any orc who dared to go to the river to get water would be baptized by the Murlocs' crude javelins. Everything that Duque did had greatly helped the whole of Stormwind. Recalling the changes that Duque had made to the kingdom, Lang was deeply moved. I wonder how his and Anduin's raid is going. I hope they can come back safely. It's okay. If they were killed, I think Sardra's would be the first to come and show off. The queen comforted Lang gently. Lang suddenly smiled bitterly. Nearly 1,000 years ago, my ancestors came to Stormwind City, cut their way through brambles, and started a magnificent era for the people. No matter what, I don't want Stormwind City to be destroyed in my hands. You won't. Instead of thinking about this, why don't you think about how you will reward them for their achievements if they return in triumph? How about erecting a statue for them in the King's Valley? Good idea. At this moment, Duque, whom Lang and the entire upper echelons of Stormwind had placed high hopes on. He was facing the most dangerous battle since his transmigration. Because his opponent was Ghoul Dan. Even if this was just a fictional Ghoul Dan created by some unknown magical principle. In this strange chess space, Ghoul Dan was still incomparably powerful. Breathing in the slightly cold air, Duque felt the smell of blood and dry heat in his nose. He couldn't suppress the excitement in his heart, telling himself that he was writing a legend that belonged only to him at this moment. Chapter 115. Duque raised his head and glanced upwards. In this chess space, time and space had already disappeared. Through the battlefield that was filled with swords and blades, there was only an endless black and white grid in the distance, while the sky was empty. The only thing he could pay attention to was his opponent. On the other side, Lothar was fighting Blackhand to the death. It was not an easy task. The orcs could afford to drag it out, but the humans couldn't. Once the Murlocs and Gnolls retreated, it would be the end of the humans. Anduin had no choice but to attack. That was definitely good news for the orc chief who preferred to fight head-on. The huge hammer was heavy and swift. Blackhand's arm strength was beyond human imagination, and the violent wind pressure that seemed to cause a small mountain to collapse every time he swung the hammer made Lothar feel suffocated. However, Blackhand's movements were so fast that every swing of his hammer seemed like an illusion. Lothar was caught off guard and was forced to clash with the hammer and sword. Lothar was almost killed instantly. A long sword was a light weapon, and compared to a heavy weapon like a hammer, it was not very durable. Besides, Blackhand's sledgehammer was specialized. It weighed more than 300 kilograms. Almost at the instant of the clash, Lothar was already cursing himself in his heart. Why did he have to fight with this monster whose strength was comparable to that of the legendary giants? This was because this hammer strike had almost broken his king's sword. Although the long sword in Lothar's hand was a light weapon, it had actually inherited the will of Thoradin the Great, and was filled with the desire for freedom and survival of countless ancestors. The king's sword had already surpassed the epic level, and was close to the level of an artifact. Although the blade of the sword was thin and slender compared to Blackhand's hammer, it was something that would break easily. In terms of hardness and tenacity, well, Lothar still remembered how he used to poke holes in the marble with the king's sword when he was young. However, when such a semi-divine sword clashed with Blackhand's hammer, it still produced a muffled groan that went straight to Lothar's soul. Even if it wasn't to the extent of the groan, it still made Lothar give up on the idea of a quick victory. Lothar glanced at Garona from the corner of his eyes. The ferocious female orc was currently beating up Blackhand's aide-de-camp Orgrim. It seemed that Garona had the upper hand. Garona's figure flickered as she used the cold gleam of her dagger to slash at the spots where Orgrim's flesh had been exposed. If Orgrim was a human, even if his vitals weren't severely injured, he would still die from excessive blood loss. It was a pity that the vitality of the orcs could not be measured by human standards. Besides, it was obvious that he was not a real living orc. Orgrim's ferocity did not diminish at all. Rather, Lothar was more concerned about Garona. Thieves had a natural disadvantage against warriors. The offensive seemed fierce, but if the warrior's counterattack succeeded, the thief would be defeated. Warriors were thick-skinned and had countless opportunities to make mistakes. Thieves, on the other hand, could lose their lives if they made a single mistake. Of course, Lothar was most worried about Duque. Duque gave Lothar a strange feeling. His aura was that of an earth rank, but his attacks felt like that of a sky wizard. Alright, let's say that Duque was the same as his master, hiding his strength. However, Gul'dan gave Lothar the feeling that Gul'dan's strength was comparable to Mediva's. Even if the strength of Gul'dan's image was greatly reduced, Duque would have to face an opponent that was at least at the Morning Star rank. How long could Duque last? Lothar could not help but feel anxious. Duque was indeed in huge trouble. Gul'dan's strength was ridiculously high. The system genie was already sending out all sorts of warnings on Duque's vision. Duque could not help but curse the system genie. I'm courting death by challenging Gul'dan's image. Stop giving me more warnings. Only then did the system genie calm down. Low-level magic was destined to be unable to shake a higher-level mysterious force. From the very beginning, Duque had known. If not for the capacitor that he had just used, Duque would not have been able to compete with Gul'dan's image no matter what. That kind of crushing mana could cancel out any offensive or defensive spell cast by Duque without a trace. With the capacitor, everything was different. No matter how the chess level in Karazhan had changed. In essence, the chess level was still one of the bosses in Karazhan. If this real world also had things like item levels, then the difficulty of the capacitor level would be similar to the chess level or even the same. This was a bug that could be exploited by Duque, allowing him to hurt Gul'dan in the chess space with such low strength. It was still that gorgeous and blinding barrage of arcane missiles. The swooshing sounds of the arcane bullets tearing through the air had been echoing in everybody's ears since the very beginning. The arcane missiles that were blocked by Gul'dan's mage shield were not the main point. The main point was the lightning effect that was triggered after the arcane missiles hit. Capacitor was an accessory that had no limit on the frequency of activation. For Duque at the moment, it was no less than a true divine artifact. All the bystanders could hear was the incessant crackling of the electric current. At first there was only one mage hand around Duque with electricity, but later the frequency of the lightning was too high. Everyone could only see that the entire space around Duque was filled with blinding electricity. Countless bolts of lightning shot out from Duque's vicinity, pouring towards Gul'dan's direction. The wriggling electric snakes let out ferocious roars and swept across the floor tiles wantonly. They even left terrifying black electric marks on the white spaces of the floor tiles. Impossible! Gul'dan roared angrily. He kept releasing destructive flames at Duque. Every single ball of flame, regardless of whether it was quality or quantity, Gul'dan had the advantage. However, every single ball of flame was destroyed by the countless lightning arrows in the air. Gul'dan's mirror image could not understand. Why was this happening? How could a low-rank sorcerer who could only cast weak arcane missiles be able to cast such a large number of lightning attacks that could hurt him when he was in such a weak state? He began to doubt himself. Was the human his opponent, or was it the strange accessory on his waist that was his opponent? How could this kind of brainless accessory that put the cart before the horse actually threaten him? If Gul'dan had real self-awareness, he would probably go crazy. Chapter 116. The scene in front of his eyes was extremely weird. Lothar was so infuriated by Duque that he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He didn't know how to face Duque at all. At first glance, Duque looked so tall and mighty. His short black hair was all standing up because of the arcane energy waves. Wearing the classic robe of the Royal Mage Group of Storm City, Duque stood at the center of the battlefield with two clusters of blue and purple arcane energy in his hands. Countless hands of magic made of white light floated in the air, and the light from the continuous barrage of purple and blue arcane bullets reflected the relaxed expression on Duque's face. He wasn't very tall. Perhaps because he was too young, Duque was even shorter than everyone on the scene, but everyone felt that he was taller and more stalwart than anyone else. His pair of black eyes were like obsidian embedded in his eye sockets, deep and wise. Countless arcane lights flashed in his or his hands of magic's palms, and then went to the place where they should go. It was to block Zhou Xian's fireballs, or to save a human elite soldier who was almost killed by the enemy's orc guards. Lothar had seen more than once that his men were in a crisis of certain death, but they were all saved by the lightning arrows that Duque released with multicasting. A flash that was similar to a blind, or a direct attack. Duke's every attempt to save the situation seemed to be understated, yet it was just right. Those who didn't know what was going on might think that God Duque was so awesome that not only could he easily beat up his opponents, but he also had the time to cover his teammates. In fact, that wasn't the case at all. Duque was on the losing side. Lothar finally couldn't help but roar, "Hey! Duque, do you need help?" In fact, nobody had time to help Duque, but the problem was that Lothar was worried. "Calm down. I can't win on my side, but don't think that I'll lose either. I can stall for a day and a night if I want to stall." With that said, Duque even had time to instantly cast Flame Burst to help Lothar smash Blackhand's face. Good job. Taking advantage of the gap created by Duque, Lothar gave Blackhand a heavy blow. The tip of his sword, which was sharper than a nail, easily pierced through the gap of Blackhand's armor, leaving a wound at least 5 centimeters deep. Lothar was absolutely certain that the sword had stabbed the edge of Blackhand's lung. "Who?" Blackhand let out an angry roar. He turned around and glared at Duque with his bloodshot eyes. Blackhand actually gave up to Lothar and charged straight at Duque. Hiss. Noxus sucked in a breath of cold air. He knew what would happen to Duke if he was hit by Blackhand's hammer of destruction. He had no choice but to chase after them madly. Even if it wasn't Blackhand's true body, that mountain-like terrifying figure could easily make even the most valiant of warriors feel weak when they saw it. Noxus couldn't imagine what would happen to Duke, who didn't have much actual combat experience against a Blackhand. Duque's death caused the entire situation to collapse? Even if he didn't want to admit it, Duque was already the most important member of this assault team. In a sense, Duque's existence was as important as Lothar's. Bang! Bang! With 2 sounds, 2 elite soldiers of Storm City who tried to stop Blackhand were easily sent flying. The huge iron hammers, one on the left and one on the right, were just ordinary pendulums, but that kind of unstoppable force was not something an ordinary human could withstand. There were no more obstacles between Duque and Blackhand. At this moment, Zhou Xian's mirror image also began to attack. The raging flames enveloped Duque's body. From Lothar's perspective, he could only see Duque's blurry figure. Not only the flames, but Lothar also felt the arrival of the curse. Curse of Pain, and Ignite, as well as some unknown spells, several warlock spells that could cause continuous damage poured down on Duque. Putting aside the fact that Duque had to face Blackhand, just Zhou Xian's attacks weren't something that Duque could handle. Not good. Not good. In that instant, Lothar felt as if his heart had been pierced. He almost wanted to throw his sword to save Leylin. However, the gap between mediocrity and genius was revealed in this instant. The mana that Duque had released was instantly restrained in his palm in less than 1/10 of a second. Noxus did not know how much control over arcane energy was required to achieve this. All he knew was that he had only seen magic techniques of this level on Mediva's body. Even Morning Star wizards could not compare. If the previous retraction could be considered an illusion, then the highly condensed arcane energy in his palm was instantly magnified again, turning into a clear giant palm with 5 fingers. It slapped the great chief's black hand away. Just this move alone was enough to make Noxus clap his hands in praise. This was not the end. Orc's battle instincts were terrifyingly high. While Blackhand weighed more than 250 kilograms, his body was never clumsy. Lothar could clearly see that Blackhand's body was beginning to adjust in midair. Even if he struck again, he might not be able to find an opening. At this moment, Duque used Flash. His entire body suddenly turned into a beam of light and disappeared. When his figure reappeared, he was already next to Blackhand. He spread out his right hand, and a cone-shaped cold sea breeze suddenly erupted from Duque's palm, covering Blackhand's body. This move did not depend on the attack power of Duque's magic, but on the speed reduction effect that ice magic often had. A visible layer of frost covered Blackhand's body, from his feet all the way to his waist. This caused Blackhand's efforts to adjust his posture in midair to go up in smoke. Most importantly, Lothar suddenly discovered that because Black Hand could not adjust his body, his entire back was facing him. Through the gap between Black Hand's armor and helmet, Lothar had a wonderful opportunity to kill Black Hand. In the chess space, the great chief Black Hand relied on his amazing strength, but this shameless man actually wore 2 sets of armor. The outside was a steel plate that was a full 3 centimeters thick, and the inside was an unknown leather armor. This made it difficult for Lothar to find an opportunity to kill Black Hand. But now it was different. Because of this rare body position, Lothar's long sword was able to smoothly stab into Black Hand's heart. Chi, the king's sword pierced the muscle between the back and the shoulder blade, straight into Black Hand's heart. For a moment, Lothar was worried whether this strange chess space would renege on its promise, such as counting orcs as undead creatures or something. Obviously, Lothar's worry was unnecessary. Suddenly, hundreds of lightning bolts struck down from the empty sky. Boom! Almost every soldier who was engaged in a fierce battle became absent-minded. Fortunately, the chess level abided by the rules. After the lightning bolts struck, all the enemies, including the murlocs, nagas and gnolls summoned by Duque, disappeared without a trace. Did we win? Lothar was still a little skeptical. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.